There I am. Hey, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? So let me know if you all can hear me. I'm so excited because have you guys seen the moon tonight? It was so cool. Or it is so cool because it's kind of happening right now. Hi, Steph. Hi, Ashley Lee. Thank you guys for being here. So for you know what? I actually pulled up I photographed the blood moon. How long ago was it, Steph? Last time it happened. And I hadn't seen it for a long time. Here, I'm going to share my screen really quick so I could show you guys the picture. Let's see it. I hope it works. I feel like it's been a minute. Hold on. Go back to StreamYard. Am I sharing it? Oh, it is. Okay. Hi, Anna Brown. Hi, Bammy. You can't see it in Boise. Hi, Tiffy. Oh, it's cloudy. Okay. We lucked out. We have clear skies, but I was going to photograph it, but I took this photo the last time this is a series of photos. So this is a superimposed, like 4 pictures, and I put them together. Hi, the real Batman. Yes. Okay. So if you guys haven't seen it, if you go outside and you look to your southeast, it's in the east, but like kind of south. If you have a view, right now it should be completely eclipsed because a couple of minutes ago I was out there, was a sliver. So it's really interesting. It's called the flower moon, blood moon, because it's just the color it churns when we have a lunar eclipse. And supposedly you can even see it in South America, I think in all over South America. So it covers a really wide range. It is, Steph? You can't see it? No way. So now I'm feeling like I should have photographed it because it's clear skies here in LA. So anyways, am I sharing this properly? Can you see my picture? Okay, I'm going to take it away now. So yeah, that's the photo I took last time. Yes, Ashley, do your stuff. Everyone needs to get a little cozy. It's a magical night. We have 100% full moon. Like it's not 99.9, it's at 100% tonight. So all the crazies are gonna come out. And it was a perfect night to do this reading, to finish this. And then maybe we could get into some Hunter S. Thompson next. Look at my paint. You probably can't see my painting of Hunter S. Thompson that I brought in just for this time. Because, of all the Johnny Depp stuff that's going around. But tonight we're going to be kind of going into Ressler. He talks a little bit about it in this book, about Ressler talking to John Wayne Gacy. And I don't know if you guys saw my community post of when the behavior panel interviewed or showed the interview of Ressler interviewing John Wayne Gacy. And if you pay attention in that, you'll see him light up because he's a psychopath, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. And you could see that he was just, can I see your notes? He was asking Robert Ressler if he could view his notes. And he was honored that Ressler from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was there to interview him. I mean, it's a very small distinction of people that were interviewed by Ressler and by John Douglas. So I guess, it probably makes him feel good, but it's a psychopathic blend of personalities that got interviewed. So yes, if you haven't, I found it. I actually found the interview. I'll put that in my community post maybe tomorrow or something. There's a link, and it's a really interesting interview for all of you guys who like to look at psychopaths under a magnifying glass. What is it, Bammy? I believe I've seen it before. What am I? Yes, you have to. They always say it's like the last lunar eclipse of blankety blank, but then we always have one. Tomorrow, yes. And you guys, Tiff Zavgirl she's on Eastern Standard Time, so she will be up doing the Johnny Depp trial for those of you who want a cool community to watch it with. And most of you are from her community, but anyone who might be checking in that isn't, this is Zavgirl right here. Look her up. Yes, it's Hunter S. Thompson. Hold on, let me remove this. It's a painting that our friend did. Yeah, I brought it in just for the occasion. I'm not nude. I might look nude, but I'm not nude at all. Every time Stephanie sees my shoulders, she thinks I'm nude. She just thinks I lounge around nude all the time. Steph, I'm not nude. Okay. So the first chapter we're covering tonight to conclude this 7-part series of this book is called Tightening the Net. And after that, we're going to get into the whole Gacy interview. Ready, guys? Oh, let me wind you down a little bit. So grab your favorite blanket. It's probably hot where you are. Grab your favorite beverage or your pet or your favorite person and settle in and have a big sigh. Ease your belly. And let me tell you this story of violence, I guess, but we all like that. So, all right. This is chapter 10, Tightening the Net. Back in the 1950s, a serial rapist and killer was slashing his way through the Los Angeles area. But only one investigator suspected that several seemingly unconnected murders of young women were attributable to that lone killer. The search for that killer led a quarter century later to the formation of governmental structures for tightening the net around all future serial criminals. Harvey Glatman was a killer ahead of his time. In the 1950s, he put advertisements in newspapers that promised women auditions for modeling jobs. His ad said that professional models were not wanted, but that good pay could be obtained by young women with no experience in modeling. Women answered his ads, and when they did, he offered more money than they were making in their current jobs for a few hours of discreet posing. He'd convince them to go to a secluded apartment, then ask them to take off more and more clothing as he photographed them. Glatman understood that it was most likely the women had not told friends or relatives where they were going, in case they might disapprove. Therefore, the women who posed for him would not be missed for some time. Glatman seemed to have told himself that because these women were willing to take off their clothes in front of a stranger, they were inviting rape, and so he raped them. Then he killed them so they wouldn't talk about the rapes. It's a pattern that was later replicated by other killers. Jerome Brudos in Oregon, for instance. I say that Glatman was a man ahead of his time because the idea of putting personal ads in the newspapers was new in the 1950s. Today, it's commonplace. with fringe newspapers and sometimes even mainstream magazines printing personal ads, enabling two strangers to meet. You've seen or heard of such ads. Young bachelor, handsome, seeks women interested in sharing experiences. Skiing, dancing. Most of these ads are legitimate. A few disguise a rapist or killer looking for victims. In Glatman's case, the ads were a reflection of 15 years of fantasy development, during which he had steadily escalated from infantile sexual experimentation to making passes at girls to minor sexual assault, and then to rape and murder. Los Angeles homicide detective Pierce Brooks was the man put in charge of the investigation of two seemingly unrelated murders of young women in the area. Brooks was already an unusual man, a naval officer and blimp pilot who'd become a top investigator in Los Angeles. He was frustrated during his investigation because although he felt that one man might be responsible for both murders and possibly some others in the area, he had no systematic way of checking his hypothesis. So he personally combed the newspaper files in several counties surrounding his own and local police files to see whether other murders had been committed that matched the MO of the killer he believed he was chasing. To make a long story short, this spade work eventually led to the conviction of Glatman, who, when confronted with the evidence, confessed to the murders. Glatman's extensive confession, obtained by Brooks, is one of the earliest documents of a serial killer's mind that we have, and it reflects many of the factors that I've outlined in other chapters of this book. Among the most interesting aspects of the confession were Glatman's rationalizations and reports of his conversations with women after they had been raped. As with many killers, Glatman became annoyed when a woman would try to control him. For instance, by saying that she would not tell her roommate about the rape if Glatman let her go, and that made him angry enough to kill her. Actually, the chances of his having let her get away with after the rape were near zero, for he was in the clutches of a fantasy that he'd been forming in his mind for many years, a fantasy that included murder. Glatman was tried and convicted and then executed in 1957. Brooks attended the execution. If any of this sounds familiar to you, that is because both the killer and the detective in the case have become the subjects of fictional treatments. In a seminar for mystery writers a few years ago, I presented the case of Glatman, and Mary Higgins Clark asked me for more details, which I furnished her. She used the Glatman story as the basis for her recent best-selling novel, Loves Music, Loves to Dance. Years earlier, the detective in Joseph Wambaugh's celebrated book, The Onion Field, was Pierce Brooks, though that book deals with a case other than the Glatman matter. Brooks's experiences in trying to pry information from other police jurisdictions in the vicinity of Los Angeles led him to propose a system for linking all the departments in California so that future criminals could be tracked and trapped more easily. He envisioned doing this by computer because teletypes, another option, were clumsy and not conducive to sharing information. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, computers were quite new, very large, and very expensive, and California said it couldn't afford to buy computers and use them for such police purposes. So Brooks put the idea on the back burner and went on with his career, becoming chief of homicide detectives in Los Angeles and later chief of police in Springfield and Eugene, Oregon, and in Lakewood, Colorado. In the mid 1970s, when I first began seriously looking into the personal histories of serial killers, the Glatman case caught my attention and I studied it from the public records. As the reader knows, I spent the late 1970s putting together the Criminal Personality Research Project, getting it approved by FBI headquarters, and obtaining a Justice Department grant to interview convicted murderers. In that project and in the growth of the behavioral science unit, we were beginning to institutionalize some of the personal initiatives that I had made. By this time, Teton and Melanie had retired, and I was the FBI's senior criminologist and criminal profiler. From what had been almost an ad hoc handful of men looking into murders, rapes, and abductions, we had become a formal group of people who profiled cases for local police and who were reaching out to do research in the prisons. In addition, and despite some foot dragging inside the FBI, I had managed to start a program to train experienced field agents as profiling coordinators, bringing them to Quantico in 1979 for an intensive course in what was becoming a bit more of a science and accordingly less of an art, then sending them back to their field offices. There, 55 newly trained agents became the resident experts in profiling, aided in our research, and acted as coordinators when there was a case where our help was sought. They funneled information to us and took our analysis back to the local police departments. In 1981, Quantico director Jim McKenzie and I were sitting at a bar, drinking beers after work, and I was waxing philosophic. We had already established the greatest training facility for law enforcement in the country, perhaps in the world, and at our fingerprint files and our evidence analysis laboratory had long been considered the best available anywhere. I reminded Jim that the laws had recently changed and that the FBI had new latitude to work in the areas of violent crime and had therefore been solely the province of local police departments. And I suggested that we now ought to develop at Quantico, with our growing resources in behavioral sciences and our field coordinators, a National Center for Violent Crime Analysis. Under that umbrella, I put the CPRP, Special Training for Police Interns, programs to take the result of the research projects and apply them to such areas as assisting police in making out behaviorally orientated search warrants and conducting interviews and other aspects of our in-service training for local police and for our own agents. Deadpan, Mackenzie said it ought to be the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, and that by switching two words, the concept had become his idea. We both laughed, understanding the joke about the way in which bureaucracies worked and management superiors took credit for everything. Mackenzie recognized that the National Center was my idea and that it was a good one. In the years following, Mackenzie fought hard to make the NCAVC a reality, and it certainly would not have become more than an idea without his tireless endeavors. Organizational change does not take place in the federal government without a well-placed champion of the cause. The NCAVC eventually absorbed all of the behavioral science programs at Quantico with which I had been associated. The reader will recall that Quantico began in 1972 as a training facility for in-service agents and visiting police, as well as for new agents. Much of that training of experienced personnel was later subsumed under the NCAVC. In addition, the umbrella idea incorporated a lot of research and gathering information programs that had never been done at Quantico before I started going out on my own to interview convicted murderers in prisons. From the original criminal personality research project, for instance, similar projects were developed that looked more closely at child abuse, at arson, at rape, at the minds of assassins, at spies and counter spies, and at other important subjects in criminal justice. The NCAVC became, in effect, the behavioral science research and training arm at Quantico. The behavioral science unit had enlarged its universe considerably. While we were looking into the possibility of establishing the NCAVC, I learned that a man named Pierce Brooks had obtained a small grant from the Justice Department to study the feasibility of establishing a violent criminal apprehension program. After more than 20 years, he had revived his dream of the late 1950s and had done so in a day when working with computers had become much more acceptable and a lot less expensive. In the interim between the era when Harvey Glatman was an active killer in the 1980s and the early 1980s, there had been a large and significant change in the landscape of violent crime in the United States. In the 1950s and 1960s, virtually all of the homicides in the United States were solved within a year of the time they had been committed. That was because most of the approximately 10,000 murders committed during any one year fell into the category of murders perpetrated by someone known to the victim, by a spouse, another relative, a neighbor, a coworker. Statistically speaking, very few had been done by a stranger or were for other reasons unsolvable. By the 1970s, however, the early situations had changed drastically. Now, of the approximately 20,000 murders committed annually in the United States, about 5,000 a year were going unsolved, about 25 to 30%. It was this fraction of the murders that Pierce Brooks hoped to address with his ViCAP system. In the intervening 20 years since he had initially formulated the idea, Pierce had broadened it considerably. He wanted the system to be countrywide, not just in California. And he wanted all police departments to be able to feed in data and use the data that was stored in the system to evaluate their own unsolved crimes. Learning of the National Institute of Justice grant to Brooks, I got in touch with him and invited him to be on the board of advisors of our criminal personality research project and to visit us at Quantico. When he saw what we were doing, he invited me and my immediate superior to join his own task force, which was operating from the good offices of Professor Doug Moore and the Sam Houston State University at Huntsville, Texas, one of the nation's academic centers for the study of law enforcement. I never saw anyone milk a federal grant the way Pierce Brooks did. Any person knowledgeable about the ways of government would have asked Justice for a couple of $1 million to study the feasibility of a nationwide computer system. Brooks had asked for and received around $35,000, and he shepherded every penny of the public's money. He had assembled a stellar board of experts in homicide and other relevant fields. To attend a conference in Texas, we were asked to book our air tickets months in advance and to take super savers to keep the costs down. At Sam Houston State, we stayed in dormitories, and when it came time for a meal, Brooks had buses to ferry us to fast food restaurants. No lavish expenditures here. While I admired his husbanding of the public's money, I felt that Brooks's initial plan for ViCAP would shortly become unworkable, however. His idea was to have the national headquarters for ViCAP in a room or two at the Lakewood Police Department. there would be 10 or 15 terminals around the country, only in the largest locations, which meant that each terminal would have to service 2 or 3 states. To actually run the system, he'd have to apply for federal grants each year. That was when he planned to add several goose eggs to the amount he'd requested for the initial study. After he and I got to know one another, I leveled with Piest and advised him on my view of the realities of government and grants and the like. The federal government being what it was, I said, even though he might obtain a large grant in 1982, there was a likelihood that if the administration changed in 1984, a new administration would not renew the grant and that the project would die due to the lack of funds. However, if the program was part of an already existing government agency, the refunding of it could become part of the permanent appropriation for that agency, which would mean it was much less likely to be dropped at the time of the administrative change. Moreover, I argued, if we put the ViCAP program under a federal agency, there would be offices and personnel already in place, telecommunications on site, possibly even a computer system with access capacity already installed. And the new money would be better used. One could put such a program under the offices of the post office or the health department, education and welfare. But the most logical home for it was the FBI. Even though a lot of the local police departments resented the FBI, remember that one-way street? It was clear that the FBI was the correct setting for the ViCAP program, especially in conjunction with the NCAVC, whose establishment we were concurrently exploring. Brooks had to agree with the logic of my argument, and we began to set the wheels in motion to bring the ViCAP program under the FBI. As part of the NCAVC, when the new and larger grant was obtained, Brooks would come to Quantico to manage the program during its first year. With those concepts in mind, Brooks and the FBI applied for a grant of millions of dollars to begin the ViCAP and NCAVC programs. My reasons for being so interested in ViCAP were rooted in the work I've been doing for the FBI during the previous decade. In too many cases, police who were confronted with, quote, stranger murders did not act on them in the most optimal way in the early stages. David Berkowitz had killed several people before the New York City police began to acknowledge that there was any connection among the victims or the crimes. If ViCAP had been in full operation, the connection would have been made sooner, and the arrest might have taken place in time to prevent the later murders. Also, when Wayne Williams' series of killings in Atlanta for over a year, the police denied that they had a serial killer work on their hands. ViCAP was needed to help the police in those cases, and ViCAP was needed to tie into the NCAVC and other existing government programs, such as those dealing with missing persons, for another very good reason: to release people, such as the parents of Johnny Grosh, from their agony. One can get over a death, even the death of a child, but the uncertainty of not knowing anything keeps wounds open and hurting. 10 years after the abduction of their son, the Goshes would like to know whether he's dead or alive, whether his remains have ever been found, whether his killer has ever been caught and incarcerated, perhaps for a different crime. They need to put the matter to rest, and to do so, they need information. ViCAP and the NCAVC could help to provide the information that would make them rest easier. The establishment of ViCAP and the NCAVC was no exception to the rule that making institutional change takes a while. Discussions on ViCAP continued for a year. During one of our sessions in Texas, a member of the ViCAP task force, a former reporter, burst into the room bearing the news that a man named Henry Lee Lucas had confessed to over 100 killings in nearly every state in the Union. Here, said the former reporter, was a perfect case on which to hang the need for ViCAP. Those of us with more direct expertise in homicide investigations looked more into the Lucas case, even though we did agree that its very existence might be helpful in convincing the public of the need for ViCAP. Henry Lee Lucas was a one-eyed drifter in his late 40s when he was convicted of killing an elderly woman in a small town in Texas in 1983. At the time of his sentencing, Lucas told the judge that although the authorities had nailed him on this charge, it was no big deal because since getting out of jail in 1975, he had been sent there for the murder of his mother. He'd killed hundreds of other people across the nation, some by himself and some in conjunction with another drifter, Otis Toole, whom he first met in 1979. That admission and his later detailed confessions kept Lucas off death row and sent law enforcement people throughout the country into a remarkable frenzy that lasted several years. The first people that Lucas roped in were the Texas Rangers. There were lots of inquiries coming from Texas, from police and sheriff's departments in many states, seeking to find out whether Lucas had had anything to do with some of the unsolved murder cases they still had on their books. The Rangers quietly let it be known that if you had such an unsolved case in your jurisdiction and would send the particulars to them, they'd begin an inquiry and advise you whether you ought to come to Texas and put your questions directly to Lucas. Let's say your police department in southern Illinois had an unsolved homicide, a young woman raped and knifed to death behind a convenience store, and the signs seemed to point to the murderer being a transient. You sent the case jacket to the Rangers, and they took up the matter with the prisoner. Instead of asking indirect questions to learn whether Lucas had been in Illinois on the dates in question or whether he'd ever killed anyone near a convenience store, the Rangers asked especially leading questions of Lucas. Questions that gave him the race, sex, and age of the victim, and sometimes even showed him the crime scene photographs to jog his memory, and then asked him whether he'd committed the murder. Lucas was shrewd enough to say no to more than half the cases, but he also said yes to a large percentage. And when he said yes, a representative from that police department would go to Texas to interview Lucas personally, and then, often as not, would arrange for Lucas to take a trip to the state in which the murder had occurred, to visit the crime scene, testify in a trial, and so on. Almost always, there was no other evidence and no witnesses on which to base a conviction for that crime. Incredibly, police from 35 states used this process to close the books on 210 unsolved murders. In the process, of course, Henry Lee Lucas got to leave his non-air-conditioned cell in Texas for large periods of time. On his excursions, he was conveyed to distant locations by airplane or car, stayed in motels, ate well in restaurants, and was generally treated as a celebrity. At one point early in the game, a sort of convention was held in which police officers from all over the country went to a central location to, quote, discuss the Lucas cases. I didn't attend, but I was told that this was the pinnacle of chaos. Observers liken the atmosphere to of the the pit of the commodities market, with everyone yelling and screaming and making hand gestures to try to claim certain cases as their own. My impression is that this fiasco was fueled not only by the need of police departments to close their difficult unsolved murder cases, but also by the boredom of local policemen, many of whom convinced their superiors that it was important for them to go to Texas on a sort of paid holiday in order to join the queue waiting to get the interview from Lucas. One of my superiors wanted to get in on the action and go to Texas to interview Lucas. Not really to obtain information, but just to be able to say he'd been there and interviewed such a heinous criminal. Since I controlled the purse strings of the CPRP grant on which he wanted to travel, I was able to veto that idea. One agent from our Houston office did interview Lucas and asked him whether he had committed the murders. Yep, Lucas said. The agent asked him how he'd gotten there. Drove my car, Lucas responded. Questioned further, Lucas said he wasn't certain of the location, but he thought it was somewhere in Louisiana, or maybe it was Texas. In short, he freely admitted that he'd been responsible for many hundreds of people who had died at the hands of Jim Jones in the Jonestown murder-suicides, several thousands miles away from the continental United States, when he obviously had nothing to do with them. This was a clear indication that his confessions about the hundreds of other murders were just as false. Eventually, records of Lucas's employment in the mushroom fields of Pennsylvania, sales of scrap metal in Florida, credit card receipts, and other evidence were compared and tallied, and the discrepancies in his stories were made manifest. Some of the most important work in this regard was conducted by Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Henderson of the Dallas Times Herald. Such diligent spade work established that, for instance, Lucas had physically been in Florida when a murder to which he later admitted had been committed in Texas. By the time I interviewed Lucas, years after the controversy had died down, the dust had settled, and Lucas said that he actually committed none of the murders to which he'd previously confessed. Under closer questioning, he did admit that since 1975, he had, quote, killed a few. Fewer than 10, perhaps 5. He just wasn't sure. He had told all those lies in order to have fun and to show up what he termed the stupidity of the police. As a side note, isn't it? It was Lucas and Otis Toole, that they think murdered John Walsh's son. So that's interesting. I wonder if he's going to talk about that. Sorry, get back to this. It took several years for the Lucas fiasco to be resolved. The task force member had been right, though. If we had had ViCAP up and running at the time Lucas made his first startling admission, it would have been easy to see what was the truth and what was falsehood in his confession. First, we would have asked the police departments to fill out ViCAP forms on their unsolved murders and enter them into the computer system. Then we would have analyzed them by date, location, and MO, and would quickly have been able to show that several of them had been committed at the same date in widely separate locations, thus eliminating the possibility that they were committed by the same man. By such process of elimination, we would have narrowed the field very quickly and allowed investigators to concentrate on the real possibilities. While we were still developing the prototype ViCAP form, the police in Los Angeles were in the midst of a major case they called the Night Stalker. They weren't completely sure, but they thought that a single person was responsible for a series of killings in the Hispanic areas of that city. We sent out some people from the emerging ViCAP unit to give them technical assistance, primarily to help determine which victims could be attributed to the single killer and which could not. Most of that was fairly obvious to experienced investigators, such as Frank Salerno of the LAPD, who had earlier been the point man on the Hillside Strangler case and who was in charge of the Night Stalker operation. But we were testing our form and also trying to be helpful without inserting ourselves into the limelight of the investigation. The goal was to show the police that they could use the FBI as a resource without running the risk of being upstaged. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was caught with very little assistance from the FBI, but the case did help us to revise our form, which was initially too lengthy and tried to accomplish too much, as often happens when a project is put together by a committee. Later, we made the form shorter, though it is still quite detailed and takes about an hour for a policeman to fill out. The mid-1980s, when we were gearing up to ask for funding for the ViCAP and the NCAVC, coincided with a period that Philip Jenkins of Pennsylvania State University has called, quote, the serial killer panic of 1983 to 1985. An article by Jenkins in the Criminal Justice Research Bulletin in 1988 cited numerous stories in newspapers and magazines during that period, all making the point that there were lots more unsolved murders in the United States than there had ever been before, that a large number of these were serial murders, and that new criminal justice system elements were needed to attack the growing problem. Jenkins cited the Lucas case as evidence that such matters were blown out of proportion. As I've reported earlier in this chapter, the trend certainly did show more and more unsolved stranger murders in the 1970s and 80s than in the early decades. But Jenkins was basically correct in his thesis. There was somewhat of a media feeding frenzy, if not a panic, over this issue in the mid-1980s. And we at the FBI and other people involved in urging the formation of ViCAP did add to the general impression that there was a big problem and that something needed to be done about it. We didn't exactly go out seeking publicity, but when a reporter called and we had a choice whether or not to cooperate on a story about violent crime, we gave the reporter good copy. In feeding the frenzy, we were using an old tactic in Washington, playing up the problem as a way of getting Congress and the higher ups in the executive branch to pay attention to it. The difficulty was that some people in the bureaucracy went too far in their quest for attention. Pierce Brooks and I had urged the information of NCAVC and ViCAP on good grounds, but in our minds, these were long-term projects that might not pay off right away. At least, not so far as capturing criminals at the first touch of a computer terminal button. I recall saying to Pierce that if ViCAP began officially in 1985, it would not be fully operational until 1995. My reasons for this prediction were simple to understand. Filling out ViCAP forms and sending them in to Quantico would be a voluntary procedure on the part of local police departments. It would take time to make those departments recognize the advantage to be gained by filling out and sending in those forms. And it would also take time to build a sufficient database and to perfect a system able to retrieve the information in a way that would be helpful in solving crimes. President Ronald Reagan announced the formation of NCAVC at the annual convention of the National Sheriff's Association in Hartford, Connecticut on June 21st, 1984. He said that its primary mission was the identification and tracking of repeat offenders and killers. Pilot funds were provided by the National Institutes of Justice. Pierce Brooks came on board and spent 9 months with us, and at the end of May 1985 sat down at the terminal at Quantico and watched as we entered data from the first real incoming ViCAP form into the computer. It had taken 27 years, but his dream of a way to match data from one violent crime to another had finally taken operational form. 3 days later, Pierce was on his way back to Oregon, and the program was turned over to me to manage. I didn't want it. ViCAP was a number cruncher's dream, and I'm more interested in behavioral sciences and in active, ongoing investigations. The best man for the job was a Department of Justice supervisor, Robert O'Heck, who had shepherded the large grant through the bureaucratic mills and had done a tremendous amount of work on the project and expected to run the program after it was fully established. Higher ups in the FBI had even promised that job to him. Once the FBI obtained the grant money, however, the management told Heck that they were going to administer it, not him. Heck was bitter, and so was I. Nonetheless, things kept rolling onward. In October of 85, the entire cost of funding the NCAVC was absorbed into a regular annual budget of the FBI. Its 4 basic programs were research and development, mostly consisting of my criminal personality research project, training of field agents and local police, profiling, and ViCAP. Another monkey wrench was soon thrown into the works. The original plan for ViCAP called for 1 manager and many junior analysts to do the actual work of taking the data from the incoming forms and entering it into a computer, and others who would actively cajole local police departments into using the forms for their unsolved homicides and their violent crimes. During the first year, the money for those subordinate jobs were channeled by my superiors into the purchase of computer equipment. So we had some shiny new electronic playthings and no one to do the drab, time-consuming work of entering information into the system. My superiors decided that rather than use the money earmarked for data enterers and junior analysts, they would instead hire high-level managers and senior crime analysts who had very little to analyze because very little data was being punched into the system. It had been naively predicted, and all the unsolved cases would go into the computer in the first year. Since there was about 5,000 unsolved murders a year, there would have meant that by 1989, after 4 years of operation, there ought to have been 20,000 cases in the computer's memory. By that time, only 5,000 had been entered, and the program appeared to fail to live up to its potential. Only in the late 1980s, near the time of my retirement from the Bureau, were we able to hire the appropriate mid-level technicians to get data put in, and to convince enough local police departments to send us their completed forms so that ViCAP would begin to have a chance to show what it could do. There was still major cities and states that won't fully participate in the ViCAP program. And their refusal to participate means that the system has a somewhat lower chance of accomplishing the goals set for it. I believe that the federal government should mandate local departments to report their unsolved violent crimes to ViCAP, as they require to do for the Uniform Crime Reporting System. If this were done and such ViCAP reporting was standard procedure in all police departments, I'm certain that we would reduce the 25% of all unsolved homicides to between 5 and 10%. Here's my reasoning. ViCAP doesn't all have to do with serial murders who would be traced because, for example, we were able to match the pattern of knife wounds on victim A in Massachusetts to those of victim B in New Hampshire, giving police more of a lead on the killer. A lot of other crimes would feed into it. For instance, say that you had a single homicide by gun in New Jersey. The bullet was found, but not the killer. The information was entered into the ViCAP computer, though. Say that 2 years later, in a bar in Texas, a man was arrested for the attempted rape and a gun was seized from him. Running that gun's ballistic particulars through the ViCAP computer might churn up a match, and the man arrested in Texas could be tied to the unsolved single homicide in New Jersey. We're not at that point yet, but we will be, and we need to be. As I write this in the late summer of 1991, the need for a strong ViCAP is more apparent than ever. Just recently, and after admitting to the killings of the one 10-year-old girl, Donald Leroy Evans in Gulfport, Louisiana, startled his captors and the nation by saying that he's killed more than 60 people in 20 states since 1977. 2 of the murders now have been verified, so Evans may in fact be a serial killer of serious proportions. That is not certain, however, and the whole affair could turn into a chaotic mess of the sort that surrounded the Henry Lee Lucas confession in the early 1980s, unless crimes are examined in some detail. The best way to do that would be to enter the details of every crime to which Evans confesses into the ViCAP computer, cross-check them against the FBI's missing persons and unidentified dead programs, and analyze them against the travel patterns and other particulars so the truth of his serial killer claims can be evaluated. Using all those systems is now possible, though they're not yet interlinked. You guys, this was written in the early 90s. Even though certain cities and states in this country have not wanted to work with ViCAP, England, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and other countries have shown great interest in the program. Since my retirement, I've conducted seminars in some of these countries about ViCAP and criminal profiling. They're eager to join forces and submit data in the hope of more quickly apprehending violent criminals. My original estimate that ViCAP would be fully operational by 1995 seems in hindsight like a pretty good guess after all, though I certainly took a lot of heat in the FBI for having said so in 1985. Okay, you guys, so here we're going to be getting into chapter 11, which is about John Wayne Gacy. And this kind of stuff, as you probably know, hadn't been done before. Robert Ressler was going into prisons interviewing like these sociopaths and psychopaths. So this one's called Two for the Show. Okay. On June 20th, 1988, I was the master of ceremonies for an unusual live closed-circuit video show featuring 2 of the country's most notorious and dangerous serial murderers. The occasion was an attempt to get the ViCAP program more widely accepted. In the service of the objective, we were holding the first ever International Homicide Symposium at Quantico. In attendance were the 300 law enforcement officials from the United States and abroad. Our focus was to try and standardize the procedures for investigating homicides from country to country. Each country, indeed the United States, each separate jurisdiction, seems to go about the business of examining a crime scene, questioning witnesses, and hunting killers in a different way. As a program manager at ViCAP, I wanted to make people aware of our national program for the apprehension of violent criminals. Bringing them to Washington, D.C. was the first part of the Bureau's plan. Giving our guests an experience they'd probably never have elsewhere, something to talk about when they got home, was the second part. And that unique experience was going to be provided by live interviews of two notorious serial killers. Because of my extensive interviewing of both men, done over a period of nearly 10 years each, I was able to persuade John Wayne Gacy and Edmund Kemper to, quote, visit with us from their prisons in Illinois and California. Both men trusted me and I believe would not have consented to these unique interviews had I not been in charge of the proceedings and made the request personally. After I made the arrangements, a bureau paper shuffler tried to horn in on the glory and wanted to act as the master of ceremonies. And I told him that if Gacy or Kemper heard his voice when he expected to hear mine, he might just refuse to go on with the show. And we'd all have egg on our faces. The paper shuffler decided that he'd have to settle for some brief introductory remarks and then sat down and behaved as a good audience member should, leaving the performance to me. The idea of interviewing a convicted murderer by satellite had earlier been broached to me by staff members of the Geraldo Rivera television program, but I refused to get involved in asking anyone to appear in a commercial television program, believing that this was not a proper thing for a bureau employee to do. The Rivera program had tried to convince the California prison system to let Charles Manson appear live, but had been unable to do so. Rather, the prison had allowed the program to come and do its own extensive taped interview with Manson. Later, this had to be broadcast in several parts, during which Dr. Jack Levin of Northeastern University and I were asked to critique what Manson had said. Our closed circuit program, by contrast, was interactive. The two men faced video cameras whose images were sent to Quantico via satellite and projected on very large screens. I first presented their cases in slide lectures to our audience, then acted as a funnel for the audience's questions to them. We could see them, but they could only hear us. Each man answered questions for a period of 90 minutes, and it was quite a show. For Gacy and Kemper are both extremely intelligent and articulate, in addition to being dangerous serial murderers. I had been driving to Chicago with my family in 1978 for a Christmas vacation when I heard on the radio that bodies were being discovered on the grounds of a small house near Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, not far from O'Hare Airfield and not far from where I had grown up. Several bodies had been discovered, and the radio report had said there might be many more to come. For a man interested in multiple murder, this was too important an opportunity to pass by, vacation or not. Depositing my family at our relative's home, I said a few words of greeting and apology and then grabbed my camera and took off for the crime scene. There were dozens of people swarming around, many of them families looking for hints of vanished relatives. I asked the local FBI agent for help, and he introduced me to the man in charge of the investigation, Jack Kozenzak, chief of detectives of the Des Plaines Department. By this time, the search and exhumation of the bodies had been taken over by the Cook County Sheriff's Office, and I met those investigators as well by chance. Howard Vanek, a lieutenant in that office, had been in my class at Quantico, and so I quickly became acquainted with the case at the time it was breaking. Here's how it began. December 11th, 1978 was Elizabeth Piest's birthday, and she was waiting for her 15-year-old son, Robert Piest, to finish up work at a drugstore in Des Plaines so she could drive him home for the family party. Robert told his mother he had to go out to the parking lot to see a contractor about a summer construction job, one that would pay him nearly twice as much as he was currently making at the drugstore. 10 minutes later, when Bob didn't come back for her, Mrs. Piest became alarmed, went home, and called the police. They told her that adolescent boys often don't come home when they're supposed to, and advised her to stay calm. By 11:30 that night, Mrs. Piest could wait no longer, and she insisted to the police that they start to search for her son. About 20,000 people a year are reported missing in the Chicago area, and probably 19 plus thousand of them are found within a few hours to a year. So police are often reluctant to search seriously for missing people before allowing more time to elapse than had occurred in the case. But Chief of Detectives Joe Kozenzak determined to institute a real search. He too had a 15-year-old son in the same school as Mrs. Piest and knew the Piest boy was an all-American kid, a gymnast. This was not some sort of boy to vanish and not call home. It seemed certain that something had gone wrong. Interviewing people at the drugstore, Kozenzak learned that a local contractor, John Wayne Gacy, had been in the store on December 11th, doing a remodeling estimate during which he had taken pictures of the place and written down measurements. Kozenzak had already begun looking for previous conviction records on Gacy, but none turned up by the morning of the 13th. When Gacy walked in the door of the police station in response to a call to come in to discuss the matter, Gacy was 36. A short, pudgy man with a double chin and a dark mustache. To outward appearances, he was an upstanding and civic-minded businessman, a contractor who also did interior design and maintenance work. He had been involved in local politics, had even led a Polish Constitution Day parade that featured Rosalind Carter, and had had his photograph taken with the First Lady, and had dressed up as a clown in full makeup to entertain children at a charitable event. He had lived in the same house since 1972 and was well known in the community. To Kozenzak, Gacy denied knowing Robert Piest or having any contact with him. Joel told Gacy that he'd been seen in the parking lot with the boy, and Gacy changed his story slightly to cover the possibility that might have been seen and Gacy changed his story slightly to cover the possibility that he might have been seen in continuity with him at the parking lot, but no further. Kozenzak told me later that he had had the intuitive feeling that Gacy was lying. The way Gacy made denials was too pat and not completely convincing. Kozenzak's men obtained a search warrant and looked into Gacy's house in a very cursory way. They found some young men's clothing and a receipt for a roll of film, then being developed at a pharmacy in Des Plaines where Piest worked, a receipt not in Gacy's name. The investigation revealed that Piest had loaned his jacket to a girl who also worked in the store. She had turned in a roll of film for developing and had mistakenly left the receipt in the pocket of the jacket when she returned the jacket to Piest. Kozenzak and his superiors felt they didn't have enough information yet on which to arrest Gacy for anything. Officially, Robert Piest was still missing, But they did have enough to put Gacy under complete and open surveillance and to question his friends, associates, and acquaintances. This was a tight surveillance. The men were on the street with him. And when he was in his car, the watchers sometimes came close to walking bumpers with him, trying to provoke him into some action. Gacy was calm at first. He told the Taylors that their stupid superiors had put them up to this and that he didn't hold them personally responsible. He'd tell them where his next destination was in case they lost him in traffic, and at least once offered to buy them lunch at the diner toward which he was heading. In 5 days, under surveillance, his behavior crumbled to the point that he stopped shaving and started drinking and using drugs and shouting at people. This did not stop him from stringing Christmas lights on the outside of his home. He had been his custom at earlier holiday seasons. Gacy found 2 lawyers and asked them to institute a suit against the police for harassment, alleging that their surveillance was preventing him from doing business. The day after the lawsuit was begun, December 20th, Kozenzak finally received the paperwork that told him Gacy had been convicted of sodomy with an adolescent boy in Iowa in 1968. Gacy had spent several years in prison for that offense and had been such a model prisoner that he even started a prison branch of the JCs. The sentence had been for 10 years, but Gacy's sterling behavior won him parole in 1970. That's only 2 years, you guys. After being released, Gacy had moved to Illinois, and there had been a charge against him of aggravated battery and reckless conduct in mid-1972. A young man claimed Gacy had picked him up in a homosexual district, then had taken him home and had attempted to hurt him. A few days after Gacy's arrest, Gacy told police that this young man was attempting to extort money from him in exchange for dropping the charges, and he wanted the young man arrested for that. Nothing came of either charge. When the young man did not show up in court to press the matter of the abduction, charges against Gacy were dismissed. Armed with this new information, Kozenzak decided he had enough grounds to ask for a full search warrant, obtained one, and, together with the Cook County Sheriff's Office, arrived at Gacy's residence on December 21st with his men in force and began a thorough search of the house. Gacy was there, and the detectives accused him of holding Robert Piest in the house. Gacy denied it, but did say that back in 1972, he had been forced to kill one of his homosexual partners in self-defense, and that he had buried the body beneath the concrete floor of his garage. As the police watched, Gacy took a can of paint and spray painted the place on the concrete floor where he said the body still lay. Inside the house, the police later found a trap door to a crawl space, crawled inside, and found 3 decomposing bodies and parts of others. Gacy was arrested and charged with murder. In his initial confession, witnesses say a half-dozen detectives. He confessed to the murder of Robert Piest and to that of 27 other young males, most of whose bodies, he said, were buried beneath the house, and the last few of which, including Piest, he had tossed into the Des Plaines River. Police went to work on Gacy's home and grounds so thoroughly that when they were finished, all that was left standing were the outside walls, roof, and support beams. They were looking for Cook County Medical Examiner. The Cook County Medical Examiner told reporters, for any scrap of evidence, a ring, a belt buckle, a button that would help us identify the victims. That was because Gacy couldn't remember more than a few of the victims' names. By the time the body count was complete, there were 33 victims, 29 in and under the house, 4 in the river. More than that had died at the hands of any other single individual in the history of American crime at that time. More of the dead were young males between the ages of 15 and 20. Ted Bundy might have killed more people, but not all of their bodies were ever found or attributed directly to him. John Gacy was officially the worst killer in modern times. Gacy initially confessed to the murders in some detail, then, on the advice of counsel, said no more. The killings, Gacy had admitted, began one night in January 1972. He had trolled the Greyhound bus station near Chicago's Loop for sex partners. He brought home a young man and had sex with him. According to Gacy, the next morning he saw that young man coming at him with a knife, struggled with him, and managed to stab his attacker in the chest. He buried this young man in the crawl space. Later in 1972, Gacy married for the second time. His first marriage, which produced 2 children, ended in divorce during his earlier prison term. The second wife asked him about the wallets of young men that Gacy had in the house, but he shouted at her that this was none of her business, and she put them out of mind. Then she complained of strange odors in the home, and while she was away on vacation, Gacy later said, he poured concrete over the first body to conceal the smell. Gacy's mother-in-law and the wife's children from a previous marriage lived with the couple during the next few years, during which, according to the mother-in-law, the odor of, quote, dead rats continued. So did the murders. Gacy couldn't remember precisely when he'd killed for the second time, but remembered it was between 1972 and 1975. And forensic evidence later corroborated this date. He strangled a young man, then placed him in the bedroom closet for storage before burial, and became a bit distressed that bodily fluids leaked out of the victim's mouth and stained a carpet. Subsequently, he told authorities he learned to stuff cloths or other materials in his victims' mouths to prevent any telltale leaks. According to that first confession in mid-1975, John Butkovich, a 20-year-old construction employee of Gacy's, came to the house with some friends and demanded back wages owed to him. After an unresolved argument, Butkovich left. Later that night, Gacy was cruising in his car and picked up Butkovich. He took the young man back to the house and offered him drinks. Then he said he'd show him a handcuff trick. Handcuffed, Butkovich was helpless, and he sputtered at Gacy that if he ever got out, he'd kill him. In response, Gacy showed Butkovich his second deadly amusement, the rope trick, in which Gacy placed a noose around the young man's neck, stuck a stick in it, and tightened it slowly, strangling him. Gacy's handcuff and rope tricks were later described by several young men who had been picked up by Gacy and taken to his home but had refused to participate in those, quote, magic demonstrations, and so had survived. Butkovich did not, and was buried in a trench at the end of the tool shed near the garage, and also covered with concrete. The Butkovich family suspected Gacy at the time, but police did not follow up on their suspicion. If the police had only paid attention to us, they might have saved many lives, Butkovich's father told reporters. The police didn't follow up, most likely because they thought that Butkovich, like thousands of other young men around the country, had simply run away from home. Moreover, to have uncovered the crime, they would have had to have some tangible evidence, even to ask a judge for a search warrant of Gacy's home, and they had none. Later, more was learned about Gacy's techniques for luring and controlling his victims, and about his sadistic acts. He usually cruised the homosexual districts for victims, many of whom were transients and would not be missed for some time. On other occasions, he struck close to home, convincing some part-time employees to come to his residence on the promise of paying back wages. Once there, they would be plied with liquor and drugs, and then he would offer to show them movies. He'd begin with heterosexual pornography, then introduce some homosexual films. Then, if the young man did not object too strenuously, he'd bring out the handcuff and rope tricks. When a victim was immobilized, Gacy would sexually assault him. Afterward, Gacy would often put him in a bathtub, sometimes with a plastic bag over his head, and nearly drown him, then revive him in order to inflict more sexual assaults and torture. Gacy was a smart man with a high IQ, but more important, he was a highly manipulative man with good verbal skills, able to diffuse a victim's paranoia and curiosity about himself. He was a spider who had to get victims into the very center of the web before being able to kill them. Whereas Ted Bundy would hit women in the face with a crowbar, Gacy used neither guns, nor knives, nor blunt instruments, but immobilized his victims through trickery and deceit. The more he got away with the abductions, assaults, and murders, the more elaborate the rituals and the torture became. With a high opinion of himself and a low one of the police and everyone else, Gacy transformed himself into a practiced and expert killer. In February 1976, Gacy's second wife and her family moved out, and his killings began to escalate at a rate of approximately one a month. As he went on, Gacy must have come to believe that he was invincible, for he was not even ever suspected in the murders. He became more bold and cavalier, not resorting to the anonymity of the homosexual district, but taking young men right off the street, one of whom had been on his way home from horseback riding, others from his part-time employees. Young males between the ages of about 15 and 20 simply disappeared. And most of the time, it was believed they had simply become runaways. While the killings continued, so did Gacy's success in the local business communities. He became a block captain, toured the children's wards and hospitals in his homemade clown outfit, and threw an annual block party for 400 neighbors. He was always available for any chore, washing windows, setting up chairs for meetings, even fixing someone's leaky faucet, a local Democratic Party official told reporters, and concluded, "I don't know anyone who didn't like him." Early stories in the newspaper stressed the idea that Gacy was a Jekyll and Hyde character. As I have argued in other chapters of this book, the Jekyll and Hyde story is simply not the right explanation for this sort of murderer. The deadly side is always there, but the murderer is frequently successful in hiding it from the outside world. When Gacy was traced back in time, it was possible to see that the strange murderer side of him had been in evidence for 15 years. Back in the 1960s in Iowa, when he managed 3 fried chicken franchise restaurants for his first father-in-law, he would use his position to lure young male employees into having sex with him. In an official statement of facts submitted by the state's attorney of Cook County, it is alleged that young men would be rewarded with sex if Gacy's first wife. Young men would be rewarded with sex with Gacy's first wife in return for oral sex with Gacy. Moreover, when a sodomy victim reported him to the authorities, Gacy hired another young man to beat him up and convince him to not testify. It was only after one well-connected victim complained that Gacy was charged with sodomy, convicted, and sent to jail. That's the one that he did 2 years for instead of 10. Class rings, car title papers, and other possessions of the dead victims were found in Gacy's home. In one case, Gacy had sold a dead victim's car to an employee. In fact, he had kept a trophy from almost every victim. By early 1978, Gacy considered the crawl space and other caches on his property to be too full of bodies to contain any more, and he began dumping victims off bridges into the Des Plaines River. When Kozenzak and his investigators questioned Gacy in his home on December 12, 1978, the body of Robert Piest was still in the attic. Somehow, before the intense phase of the police surveillance began, Gacy managed to sneak the body out of the house and throw it too into the river. It was not even found until after Gacy's trial. By that point, only about half of the victims had been positively identified. At the trial, Gacy's attorneys argued that he suffered from having multiple personalities. That, quote, Jack Handley had done the murders. Gacy suggested that his Jack and John personalities were opposites. The actual Jack Handley had been a police officer in the Chicago area whose name Gacy had appropriated. Still later, Gacy argued that because of the nature of his business, at least a dozen men had keys to his home. And some of his associates lived there from time to time and could also have been involved in murders. He revised his own story to say that he had killed only a handful, not 33, and to say that he certainly had not killed every young man with whom he had sex. Some of those theories began to surface in 60 hours of audio tapes that Gacy recorded for use by his attorneys at the trial, tapes in which Gacy also admitted to many of the murders. The state pursued a case solely against Gacy, ignoring some evidence that there might indeed have been other people involved. 2 associates of Gacy's who did spend time at his home. This is something that often happens in big cases. The DA pursues the one very good suspect and doesn't develop the others because that would complicate an otherwise straightforward prosecution. The important thing seems to be able to handle the case, and so the prosecution can be successful in obtaining a verdict against an obviously guilty man. At the trial, Gacy and his attorneys presented a defense of him as not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution countered by demonstrating that the steps Gacy took to procure his victims, to render them immobile, to kill them, and then consciously, after death, to conceal their bodies, argued that Gacy's crimes were premeditated murders, and that he clearly knew the difference between right and wrong at the time of the crimes. After nearly 6 weeks of trial, the jury pronounced him guilty of the murders of 33 victims, and Gacy was sentenced to die in the electric chair. After his conviction, I requested an audience with John Gacy, and he consented to see me. Together with some associates from the BSU, Gacy claimed to know me from his childhood. Our homes were 4 blocks from one another, and he remembered delivering groceries to my mother's house, even describing some unusual flower pots that were part of the landscaping. So we talked about the neighborhood and developed a relationship of sorts. I learned enough about conversating with murderers so that I was able to approach Gacy on a rather objective basis without stigmatizing him for what he'd done. By this time, Gacy had become convinced that the police, the psychiatrist, and the courts were all full of fools who simply did not understand him and were beneath him intellectually. But that I was schooled in the ways of intelligent killers and could talk to him about his life in a reasonable way. Gacy states that 2 or 3 of his former employees were involved in the crimes. As part of my interchange with Gacy, I told him that I agreed that police should have done more vigorous things to pursue those employees who stayed in the Gacy house from time to time. I was sincere in that belief and still feel today that there are unexplored avenues that might be traced and might reveal others who were involved in the murders. Gacy would not speak directly to the media and even refused monetary offers for interviews. He said he wanted to tell his story one day, and I urged him to do so. However, I cautioned that he'd have to be candid and not claim he hadn't killed all of the victims. In fact, I told him I thought he might have killed more than 33, since he traveled widely in 14 states. He could have thronged homosexual transient districts for victims elsewhere. Gacy neither admitted nor denied my accusation. Through the years, I continued to stay in touch with Gacy. In our later conversations, he devalued the young men he killed as worthless little queers and punks. I challenged him about that. Why was he running down his victims if they were worthless homosexuals? What was he? Gacy's answer was that they were useless runaways, while he was a successful and busy businessman who didn't have many hours available for dating. He told me that he found it more satisfactory to have quick sex with a young man than to wine and dine and romance a woman, which took too much time away from his very full schedule. This didn't sit well with me, and I simply had to accept his comment without question at the time in order to maintain our rapport. Gacy later made a painting and sent it to me. It depicts a clown dressed in a similar outfit to the one that Gacy had used, posing in the midst of a grove of evergreen trees, surrounded by balloons. The inscription read, "You cannot hope to enjoy the harvest without first laboring in the fields." Some people take this as a compliment to me, with the meaning that I was able to get close to Gacy because I had spent so much time working with multiple murderers and so had been properly prepared to talk to him. On the other hand, some people interpret the inscription to mean that there are even more Gacy victims who have not yet been found. Gacy himself refuses to explain. People who become notorious through crime often attract outsiders to them. That's what happened to John Gacy in prison in 1986. A twice divorced woman with 8 children came to visit him, and they started to extend correspondence. 2 years and 41 letters later, the woman was persuaded to let the Chicago Sun-Times publish excerpts of some of the letters. They contain such passages as the following. "I'm a gullible person, and I think you are too. But you can overcome it. And it has nothing to do with educational background. I hold 3 college degrees. Big deal. It doesn't mean a thing without common sense. Streetwise people you can learn from. But you've got to be on guard for the con too. I mean, what the..." Deleted. "The state said I was manipulative or a manipulator. Hell yes. But had I not been, I would not have been successful. You wouldn't be successful undercover if you didn't manipulate at times." Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Marvin Zipperin who had been the chief psychiatrist at the prison where Gacy was incarcerated, evaluated the letters for the newspaper and wrote an analysis of them. Zipperin had also interviewed Richard Speck in depth and had written a book about Speck, Born to Raise Hell. Zipperin wrote that in every letter, almost in every paragraph, Gacy displayed two major themes of his thinking. The first was that Gacy's view of himself was a nice guy, which Zipperin said meant heterosexual, helpful, friendly, generous, loving, virile, and courageous. Simultaneously, Zipperin wrote, Gacy was at pains to deny that there was a bad me, bad being weak, cowardly, and above all else, homosexual. That bad me had committed the murders. His denial of the bad me allowed the belief in himself as fundamentally good. Here, wrote Zipperin, was a classic sociopath, a man whose huge ego exists solely to satisfy his own appetite for existence. His answer to the question, what is one allowed to do, is whatever one can get away with. His answer to the question, what is good, is whatever is good for me. Even in the letters, Gacy was trying to control his new friend, telling her, says Zipperin, what to do, what to think, how to deal with her family, how to manage her affairs. And it was in this display that one could see Gacy's need to control and dominate, the dynamic that led to his involvement in bondage and murder. In later years, Gacy had come to believe that his troubles were traceable to his early childhood. Born of immigrant parents, Polish and Danish, he grew up in a household where discipline was strict and his father drank and often bullied family members. He claimed to have been molested at the age of 5 by a teenage girl and at the age of 8 by a male contractor. By the age of 10, he was having epileptic seizures, and his medical conditions kept him out of sports and other activities in high school. When he began work, he was out for medical reasons 1 day in 3. He also insisted that his mind was affected by alcohol and drugs. Later, he came around to the story that he had not even been living in his home at the time the bodies were discovered, that the crimes had been committed by someone other than himself. In late 1972, Santa Cruz, California seemed like a murder capital of the United States. Every month there would be a report of another grisly crime. A body found here, a hitchhiker vanished there. There were more such reports per capita than in any other locality in the country. Residents were conscious of the murder epidemic. Many had bought guns, and security was beefed up at the campus of the University of California at Santa Cruz, from which several women had vanished. Later, it would be understood that 3 multiple murderers were working in the area at approximately the same time: John Wayne Frazier, Herbert Mullen, and Edmund Emil Kemper. Frazier and Mullen were apprehended, but the killings continued until Easter weekend of 1973. The Tuesday afterward, at 3 in the morning on April 24th, 1973, a call came to the Santa Cruz Police Department from the public phone booth in Pueblo, California. The caller said he was Ed Kemper, a highway department employee well known to the police because he often hung out with them in the bar near the courthouse in the town's gun shop. Kemper wanted to talk to a particular police lieutenant, but settled for the man on duty. He wanted, he said, to confess to the killings of various co-eds from the Santa Cruz campus and to the killings of his mother and a friend of his mother's. If someone would come to Pueblo and pick him up, he'd point out where the bodies could be found. There was some disbelief at the Santa Cruz station. One of those on duty thought Kemper was just pulling the desk man's leg, but Kemper responded to some questions with more intimate knowledge of the details of the co-ed murders than anyone other than the killer might possess. While While Kemper was still on the line, the Santa Cruz department contacted the Pueblo department and asked them to pick up Kemper and hold him until a Santa Cruz man arrived. When the Pueblo department went to the phone booth, they thought at first that it was occupied by two people. Kemper, at 6'9" and 300 pounds, was large enough to convey that illusion. 5 years later, when I first talked to Kemper, his size struck me right away. I had known about it, of course, but a man that big gets your attention. He stuck out his hand, shook mine, and immediately wanted to know if in exchange for the interview, I could obtain some privileges for him and some stamps for his correspondence. I said I'd give him the stamps, but couldn't offer him anything else. Nonetheless, he was willing to talk and had pretty good insight into his crimes, having been counseled by mental health professionals for quite a while and having spent part of his prison time as a clerk in the psychological section of the institution. He believed his crimes had been precipitated by his hostility toward his mother, who had been oppressive toward him, and that they had stopped when he had finally killed the source of his problems. That was quite a neat and precise explanation of a complex matter. So I asked Kemper where he thought he fit into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, then in its second edition. He said he knew the categories, had read the book, but didn't find a description that fit him, and didn't expect to, until psychiatry had obtained sufficient information to understand people like him. When would that be? When the DSM was in its 6th or 7th edition, he answered. And that wouldn't happen until sometime in the next century. In answering in such a manner, Kemper was trying to tell me how unique he was, and was also reflecting the position of a leading psychiatrist who had spoken to him at length and written a book about him, and who had thought that this sort of criminal came along about once in 200 years. I disagree. Ed Kemper, though certainly remarkable, is not so rare as a bird. There are other murderers like him. He differs from them, perhaps, in the degree of his brutality and the depth of what he endured in his childhood. His size has always been a problem. He had become too large, too fast. He never had the opportunity to be a true child because he was large enough so that people treated him as if he were older. He did not have friends of the same age, and those that were the same size as he were years ahead of him mentally. His size was not an insurmountable obstacle to a productive life. The ranks of professional sports are filled today with outsized men who were once outsized boys, and none of them have become multiple murderers. However, the fact that Kemper's size was combined with the stresses of a severely dysfunctional home, one with an alcoholic and overbearing mother, an absent father, favored sisters, and a grandmother who was in many ways a worse nurturer than a mother. The mother would continually belittle Ed, tell him he was a source of her problems, and abuse him mentally in other ways. To me, the most telling event occurred when Kemper was 10. Without his knowledge, his mother and sisters moved him from the second-story bedroom he'd occupied down to a spooky old basement room near the furnace, because he was too big and they considered it unhealthy for him to be around his 13-year-old sister or in the same bedroom as his younger sister. They considered him a sexual threat to them. This shocked Kemper and brought his attention to sexual issues. Afterward, his fantasies, which had begun at an even earlier age, took a turn for the worse, now entailing bizarre sexual activity with his sisters and his mother, and the killing of these tormentors. From time to time, at night, Ed would take a knife and a hammer and slip into his mother's room and fantasize about killing her. The move into the basement at age 10 came at around the same time as his mother's first divorce from Kemper's natural father. The mother remarried and divorced twice more before the time Kemper was 10 and 14. Each time when the marriage was going badly, Kemper's mother would send him out to live with his grandparents on the farm. And he would come to hate that. At the same time, on the farm and in his mother's orbit, he became familiar with firearms. One of his stepfathers was an expert and demanded that Kemper be a good shot and know about guns, safety, ammunition, and the like. As discussed earlier, the grandparents took a gun away from Kemper when he used it, as the stepfather seemed to be urging, to kill small animals. Such a confusion of messages characterized much of what Kemper had to bear. In 1965, at age 15, when his mother was in the throes of yet another marital change, Kemper was sent to the farm. He was miserable and felt used by his grandmother and ostracized from his schoolmates. One day, Kemper came up behind his grandmother as she was typing a letter at her desk. She had decreed that he must stay around the house and help her with chores that day, when he had wanted to go out into the fields with his grandfather, whom he liked better. He shot his grandmother with a rifle, then stabbed her. Having done this, he next realized that he didn't want his grandfather to see the gruesome sight, so he waited until his grandfather was approaching the house and then shot him too, before he could enter the house. As if to make a clear connection between this murderous act and the source of his problems, Kemper then went into the house, called his mother at her vacation cottage, and told her that her honeymoon would have to be cut short because he had just killed her parents. Kemper spent the next 4 years in the Adjudicating State Mental Hospital. During this time, he took dozens of mental tests and did well on them, possibly because he was able to find out the answers that the mental health personnel found appropriate. Later, he would let it be known that he had memorized 28 of the tests and the correct answers. In 1969, the mental health and correctional professionals at Adjudicating State pronounced Kemper to be fit to return to society. He was, after all, still technically a juvenile. Over the objections of the state prosecutor, he was released to a California Youth Authority camp. The next year, at his mother's in session, he was paroled into her custody. This against the recommendations of the parole board and of some of the psychiatrists. Looking back, I found rather amazing this parole of Kemper into the custody of the woman who had been the source of his problems. He lived with his mother and worked as a laborer at the Green Giant canning plant. That's funny because he's like a big guy. His mother continued to push the justice system to expunge Ed's juvenile offense from his record, and as he neared adulthood. Though his mother had rescued him, she never stopped abusing Kemper mentally. "Because of you, my murderous son," she would tell him after he returned, "I haven't had sex with a man in 5 years because no one wants to be with me out of fear of you." In terms of sexuality, Kemper himself was still a virgin and remained so. During the years he might have experimented with sexual contact, he was in a mental institution and became even more fixated on himself and his fantasies. At an apartment he rented for the times when he was not staying in his mother's house, he gazed at pornography and read detective magazines for erotic and violent simulation. His murderous fantasies had not abated. In fact, they had grown more detailed and intense. Later, he would tell authorities that during his years at Atascadero, he spent a lot of time perfecting a method for disposing of bodies after he'd murdered people. No psychologist had been able to elicit from Kemper this sort of information at the time he was incarcerated as a teenager. My belief is that Kemper deliberately concealed the fantasy, knowing that to reveal it would surely hinder his release from custody. Kemper started work for the State Highway Department in 1971 and then put in an application to become a state trooper. Several law enforcement agencies turned him down, evidently because of his size, but he began to hang out with the police in Santa Cruz. One friend gave him a training school badge and a pair of handcuffs. He borrowed a gun from another acquaintance. He had a car that looked somewhat like a police cruiser with a CB radio and a whip antenna. When he wasn't in that car, he was on a motorcycle. His state credentials, when flashed quickly at a naive observer, could pass for those of a state trooper. In February 1971, while riding the motorcycle, he was hit by an automobile and severely injured his arm. He filed a civil suit because the injuries forced him to wear a cast for many months. And in December of 1971, he was awarded an out-of-court settlement of $15,000. The cast on his arm made it impossible for him to do the highway work, so now he had money and time on his hands. His mother had become a well-liked administrative aide at the campus of the Santa Cruz branch of the state university, and she obtained a car sticker for Kemper so that he could come on campus to pick her up after work. Helpful to students and faculty on campus, she seemed to take out all her frustrations on Kemper. Their relationship worsened. After one horrendous fight in the spring of 1972, Kemper slammed the doors of her home on his way out and vowed that the first good-looking girl he saw that night was going to die. That victim was never found, and Kemper was never indicated for that killing, about which he furnished few details. He did kill 2 young women on May 7th, 1972, who were later identified. Both were Fresno State College students who had been to see their boyfriends at Berkeley and were hitchhiking to Palo Alto to visit other friends at Stanford. Kemper went after these victims, he later told me, because they were, quote, hippie girls, the sort he professed both to admire and despise, and because there were lots of them on the roads. In other words, they were available victims who would probably not be missed for some time. That same summer of 1972, when Kemper picked up those 2 potential victims on the highway, a woman researcher named Cameron Smith was picking up a female hitchhiker at Berkeley and asking them to fill out a questionnaire. According to a report of her work in Ward Damio's book about Santa Cruz murders, Mrs. Smith discovered that 24% of those hitchhikers she interviewed had been raped while hitchhiking. Another 18% had been attacked, while 27% told her they had been subjected to attempted rapes or other perverse acts. Only about a third had completed their rides without incident. Despite these frightening odds, young women continued to hitch rides in the Berkeley area. And so by the side of the major highway, Ed Kemper was able to pick up 2 teenage girls in blue jeans who were carrying overnight bags. He had his handcuffs and badge, as well as a knife and the borrowed gun. Pointing the gun at the girls, he told them he was going to rape them and pulled off the highway onto the side road. Evidently, the women believed that they were not going to be killed and therefore decided not to fight back at first. Kemper was able to talk one girl into climbing into the trunk. Then he got in the back seat of his car, handcuffed and tied up the second girl, then stabbed and strangled her. He didn't use the gun because bullets from it would have been traced. After killing the first girl, he opened the trunk and stabbed the second to death. With the 2 bodies in the car, he drove to his apartment, and there he decapitated the bodies and cut off their hands. At the apartment, he cleaned himself up as much as possible. There was still blood on the cast. Later, he'd cover this up with white shoe polish until he could convince his doctors to make a new cast for him. The amount of blood and the difficulties Kemper experienced in killing the women with a knife shook him, and he vowed that the next killings would be less messy. That night, he took off the clothing from the dead bodies and copulated with them. Next morning, he realized that he had made at least 3 mistakes that could have gotten him caught, and he decided to proceed even more carefully from then on. As he had fantasized doing in Addis Castadro, that day he dumped and buried the bodies in several different places, the heads in a different spot from the torsos, and the hands in a third location. Anyone who found the torsos would be unable to identify the bodies because there would be no faces or dental work and no fingerprints. The burial sites were in a complete different county from the one where he had picked up the hitchhikers. He disposed of his victims' clothing in remote canyons in the Santa Cruz mountains. But were not found for several months. In August, the severed head of one girl was discovered. It yielded her identity, but absolutely no clues as to how she had died. By that time, Kemper's mother was lobbying hard to have Ed's juvenile record of the murders of his grandparents sealed by the court. The district attorney objected, saying they should be kept open at least 10 more years. A psychiatric examination of Kemper was scheduled for mid-September. 4 days before that test, Kemper went out hunting again. He picked up an attractive woman hitchhiking with her 12-year-old son. As he drove away, he noticed that the woman's friend who saw her off had taken down his license plate number, so he ferried the mother and son to their destination and then returned to the outskirts of Berkeley, nearly desperate to find a victim. This indicates to me that Kemper is a highly organized offender whose intellect is firmly in control of his compulsion to kill. He saw an Asian girl, a 15-year-old ballet student, and he picked her up. Told she was being kidnapped, the girl became hysterical, but when he pulled out a new gun borrowed from another friend, she quieted, and he kept her docile by saying that he had problems and wanted to talk to her about them. Stopping the car just north of Santa Cruz, he smothered her until she was unconscious, raped her, then strangled her to death with her own scarf, and had intercourse with her corpse. With the body in the trunk of the car, Kemper then decided to go to visit his mother for a while. It was strangely pleasurable for him to chat with her while he had a dead girl in the car. An important element in the growth of a fantasy could be discerned from Kemper's pleasure in conversing with his mother while he knew he had a dead woman in the car just a few yards away. Here was something he would add to the ritual to prolong the excitement of the fantasy. The reality would never become as good as the fantasy, he would later tell me, but he kept on trying to improve both his performance and the elaborate nature of the fantasy. Among the topics Kemper discussed with his mother that night might have been the forthcoming psychiatric examination. Once the records were sealed, Kemper's mother had told him many times he would be free of the past. Later in the evening, in his apartment, Kemper placed the body in his bed and again had intercourse. In the morning, he spent several hours meticulously dismembering the body, flushing the fluids down the drain, and afterward pouring Drano in the drain to remove any evidence from the system. Then he took to the back roads with his burden. He buried the hands in one county, the torso in another, and kept the head in the trunk of his car. The head was still in the trunk of the car when he went to visit one of the psychiatrists appointed by the court. That, too, gave Kemper a kick. Both psychiatrists who examined him in September of 1972 concluded that he had made excellent progress during his time at Castero. One of them wrote, "If I were seeing this patient without having any history available or without getting the history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who has initiative, intelligence, and who is free of any psychiatric illness. In effect, we're dealing with two different people when we talk of the 15-year-old boy who committed the murder and that of the 23-year-old man we see before us now. It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or any member of society." The second psychiatrist added, "He appears to have made a good recovery from such a tragic and violent split within himself. He appears to be functioning in one piece now, directing his feeling towards verbalization work, sports, and not allowing neurotic buildup within himself. Since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records. I'm glad he has recently expunged his motorcycle, and I would hope that he would do that permanently, since this seemed more a threat to his life and health than any threat he is presently to anyone else." Since both psychiatrists recommended the sealing of the records so that Kemper could get on with his life, on November 29, 1972, they were officially sealed. After killing the Asian dancer, Kemper was able to keep a lid on his murderous impulses for the next several months before and just after his juvenile records were sealed. With the turn of the new year, however, the urge to kill resurfaced. He returned the guns that he had borrowed from his friends and sought one of his own. Now that his records were sealed, he had a legal right to own a gun. He drove to the town where he had worked on the food factory and purchased a .22 pistol with a long barrel and some hollow point ammunition that exploded on impact. That same afternoon in daylight, he picked up another hitchhiker, a rather heavy young girl. He told her he wanted to talk, and she seemed sympathetic. Nonetheless, he killed her with a single bullet from his new gun, then drove to his mother's home. She wasn't there, so Kemper took the body from the car and stashed it in his bedroom closet. After his mother left for work the next morning, he dismembered it. Part of the reason for severing the head was to remove the spent bullet from it. That way, there would be no ballistic evidence to connect him with the crime. He threw the body parts over a remote cliff into the sea. Some of them were found within a few days. The head he buried underneath his mother's window. By this time, since Kemper and Herbert Mullen were both killing people in the area, many people had become frightened, and security forces were on alert to look for suspicious characters. Less than a month after killing the heavy girl and after a particularly heated argument with his mother in February 1973, Kemper went into the UCSC campus, picked up two young women, and shot them both before reaching the perimeter of the campus. The students were not quite dead, and one was groaning audibly when Kemper pulled up to the gates where two armed young rookie guards were manning the post. The men looked right into the car, but either did not see the dying woman or did not understand what they were viewing in the dark interior of the car. Though the exterior of the car was a drab tan, the interior was black. The woman in the front seat, dressed in black, was partially tumbled over into the wheel well, and the other one in the back was covered by a blanket that Kemper had purposely kept in the car for just an occasion. The guards paid more attention to the campus sticker on the window than to the moaning bundles in the car, and they let Kemper pass. For Ed, it was a moment of triumph. These bodies, too, he handled boldly when his mother was nearby, seemingly excited by the possibility that she might discover him doing it. He decapitated them in the trunk of the car while it sat in her driveway and took the heads into the house so he could look at them in his bedroom. Masturbation would be part of his ghastly ritual. He returned the heads to the car in the morning and kept all the parts in the car for the next day and more, driving the car to the home of some friends where he had dinner. Later in the evening, he dumped the parts in various places, again taking care to remove the bullets from the heads. There was a bullet hole in the car, however, and too much blood in the trunk for him to wash away completely, and other such telltale evidence. Kemper seemed aware of these matters and was a bit skittish. In early April, he bought another gun, a .44 pistol. When the sheriff received the record of the sale of the weapon, he remembered something about Kemper's early conviction and decided to make a check on it. Finding the record sealed, he nonetheless drove to Kemper's apartment and asked him for the pistol. He would hold it until a court decided whether it was legal for Kemper to own a weapon. Kemper opened the trunk of his car and without an argument gave the pistol to the sheriff. The sheriff was satisfied with that and did not search the car thoroughly, and so did not find the .22 murder weapon that was concealed under the seat. After the sheriff left, however, Kemper started playing what-if games in his mind. What if the sheriff had seen traces of blood or hair in the trunk? What if the sheriff found out that the .22 pistol, as he had learned about the .44? What if the authorities came back and searched his car, his apartment, his mother's house? What if there was now a tail on him? Kemper later told the police it was then that he decided he must kill his mother and surrender. 2 weeks after the sheriff picked up the .44 on Good Friday, April 20th, 1973, Kemper went to his mother's home. She arrived later after a faculty meeting, and they had a brief conversation in which his mother was, as usual, sarcastic to him. Once she had fallen asleep at 5 a.m, Kemper took a claw hammer from the kitchen and, as he had done so often in his imagination, went into her bedroom while she slept. This time he actually brought the hammer down with considerable force on her right temple, then slashed her throat with his pocket knife. Blood was still gushing from her as he decided to sever the head as he had done with the other victims. Another slice removed her larynx, and he threw this part into the disposal unit in the kitchen sink. When the disposal was unable to digest the larynx and spewed it back out, Kemper thought this was poetic justice. He wrapped the body in the bloody sheets and stashed it in the closet. Later in the morning, he went to the bar that was the police hangout and to the gun shop and talked calmly to some friends, even trying to borrow a gun from one of them, who refused. That afternoon, however, he reasoned that since this was a holiday weekend, family members or one of his mother's close friends who had also worked at the university might well appear at the house and discover the body. Taking the initiative, he invited his mother's associate, Sarah Hallett, to help him plan a surprise party for her, and when she arrived, he snapped her neck. He left her body on his own bed and spent the night on his mother's. Easter Sunday morning, he stuffed the friend's body in another closet, then piled his guns, the two women's credit cards, and money into a friend's car and took off on his final journey. Once in custody, he was determined to give the police the evidence they needed to convict him. He was convinced that they would never have found it on their own, and that if he had simply confessed and not led them point by point to physical evidence, a smart lawyer might later be able to discount the confession and enable Kemper to escape conviction. And so, in addition to confessing, he told police just where to find the bodies in his mother's home. And even before the public was made aware of these killings, led police to the dump and burial sites of several of the other victims. Still more evidence from the dead girls, a scarf, a textbook, and so on, was found in his mother's home, his apartment, and his car. Part of the evidence was obtained by the police by smart interrogation. They kept complimenting Kemper on his intellect, his powers of memory, his wonderful recall of detail, until he led them to such items as a blood-soaked blanket. And he said, "Here's another piece of evidence for your case." Awaiting trial, Kemper attempted twice to commit suicide by slashing his wrists and was soon transferred to solitary. The trial itself was rather short. The evidence was there and it showed clear premeditation. All the psychiatrists called to testify say that Kemper had clearly been sane when he had committed the crimes. During the trial, Kemper was asked why he'd killed the hitchhikers. "That was the only way they could be mine," he said, and added, "I had their spirits. I still have them." Kemper was soon convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to death. Asked what he thought of the appropriate punishment for his crime, he replied, "Torture." He got neither death nor active torture. Rather, he was put into prison. For although California had embraced the death penalty in principle, no one was being executed in that state at that time. In prison, Kemper calmed down and became a well-behaved inmate, accepted into the prison population, gradually given increasing amounts of privileges, if not freedom, within the institution. In our interviews, which began 5 years after his crimes, Kemper concentrated at first on the facts of the murders. In the process, telling me a number of things that were of interest to law enforcement, for example, that he had rather consciously tried to have his car appear as if it were a police vehicle, and that he had broken teeth away from the heads of his victims in order to foil attempts at identification. He spoke of the killings in a matter-of-fact way, not to shock, but as if he had been over the territory a million times in his mind and saw it as something unconnected to his everyday self. No one other than a pathologist, he contended, knew more about dead bodies than he did. For instance, he was still amused that one of the medical examiners who had made a report about one of the victims hadn't understood that he had cut her Achilles tendons, not because of some strange murderous ritual, but to prevent further rigor mortis and to aid in his sexual acts with the body. He spoke of his childhood too, not in a way that would allow him to use it to avoid responsibility for the killings, but with a sense of wonderment at what he had experienced. It had not been until his years at the mental institution that he had first begun to realize the climate in his mother's orbit was abnormal. He was really just recovering when he'd been released by the California Youth Authority and plunged back into the cauldron. I asked Kemper whether he'd committed any sexual acts with his mother's body after he killed her, and he glared at me and said that he had humiliated her corpse. He understood that even though he had killed the source of his problems, he was not relieved of them, that he would never be fit for life in the outside world again. Equally important, he told me that his fantasies drove these killings, that as time went on, during the months that he was murdering, the fantasies became more and more intricate as well as intense. Nonetheless, in the course of the murders, there was always some detail that didn't happen as planned, or that he felt could have been more perfect. That imperfection pushed him to kill the next time. The actual act of murder, Kemper concluded, was never as good as the fantasy and never would be. In 1988, during the satellite broadcast, Kemper and Gacy behaved pretty much as I expected they would. Kemper was totally candid about his crimes, admitting everything, going into gory detail at times, and giving quite a bit of psychological insight into the role that fantasy had played in his murders. His perspective was a revelation to many in the audience. In some ways, Kemper's detailed memories and explanations of his acts were a demonstration of the need to keep such murderers alive. I believe they should not be executed, but rather imprisoned and counseled so we can learn from them what we may do to prevent other would-be murderers from following their paths. Executions of such men do not serve any socially useful purpose. They do not deter other would-be serial killers who are so caught up in their own fantasies that the possibility of being caught and killed themselves do not sway them from their crimes. And actually, executions don't even save the state money, because to kill a prisoner today requires millions of dollars in legal expenses. It's more useful to keep a man such as Ed Kemper alive so we can study him. John Gacy used his 90 minutes to try to persuade the watching audience of law enforcement officials that he was innocent of all crimes for which he'd been convicted, and that they, as police experts, should pursue the loose ends and lost witnesses and make it their business to overturn his conviction and see to it that he would be set free. An appeal is actually in process for Gacy. This is when this book was written, though, and a ruling is expected shortly. Some audience members later were annoyed at me for not verbally pinning Gacy to the wall during that broadcast, for not forcing him to admit his crimes to our forum. I tried to explain that this would have served no real purpose, that my goal had been to let each of these murderers display his personality for the audience, so that, for instance, they could see for themselves Gacy's perspective, the way he now denied everything, the extent of his brilliance at manipulation. Some still didn't comprehend the point, but I guess that's why we need to have more seminars and continuing education about homicide and the minds of multiple murderers. Last chapter, chapter 12, Broader Horizons. From time to time, the formation of the BSU to the present publicly has been a two-edged sword for those of us in the unit, and I've always had it swirling around me. The uproar began back in the era when I was becoming the senior profiler, taking over from Tetton and Mullany. I was training hostage negotiators in Chicago. Patricia Leeds, a veteran police beat reporter in Chicago, was attending the classes in preparation for writing an article on hostage negotiation. We talked, and I mentioned my interest in William Hearns, whose case she knew very well. She soon wanted to visit Quantico and prepare an article about profiling and violent crime. I checked with my superior at Quantico and with the Public Affairs Division and got a sort of half approval for her come down and interview me and others in the BSU for such an article. Pat arrived and spent a day, and at the end of it wanted to stay for a second day. One prerogative that agents at Quantico have is to allow guests to stay overnight in special guest rooms. So I booked her into one of those. In the evening, we were chatting in the beer hall with several Chicago police officers who were at Quantico for a 3-month period. It was late and I wanted to go home, so I asked the Chicago men if they would escort Pat back to her room when they were finished with their beers and conversation. As fate, or the sort of luck I seem to attract, would have it, Pat was spotted in the beer hall without her agent escort by someone who knew her. He was John Otto, recently elated to deputy director of the Bureau and who had formerly been the SAC of Chicago office. Otto was passing through in the company of the convoy of the other Bureau big shots, including Director Webster and Ken Joseph, then in charge at Quantico. Joseph was annoyed because a guest was loose at the academy and had no agent escort. In the morning, Joseph confronted the academy's public affairs officer, who claimed he didn't know what a police reporter was doing at Quantico, nor why she'd been allowed to roam around without supervision. By the time I arrived for the day, Joseph was in a state of panic. Who knew what this demon reporter might write about Quantico? What if she wrote a police officer was drinking beer on FBI property? about FBI agents whose white shirts were not properly starched. Clearly, there was some reason to believe that J. Edgar Hoover's ghost really did haunt the halls at Quantico. Let's not play what-if games, I told Joseph as I sat in his office and listened to the speculation. This was a friendly reporter engaged in research for what I was certain was going to be a positive article. Moreover, I had checked with my superior and with public affairs before allowing her to come to Quantico. If the article came out and it was negative, I said, there would be plenty of reason and time to rake me over the coals. Until then, however, I considered his panic to be unwarranted. As a good friend, Ken Joseph gave way to my view on this matter, but as I left his office, I knew I owed him a favor. Pat Leeds' front page article in the Chicago Tribune on February 15, 1980 was entitled, They Study the Strangest of Slayings, with the subhead, Little Known FBI Unit Profiles Bizarre Killers. It was as accurate and as flattering as anybody could have wished, and I heard no more paranoid rumblings about unescorted reporters at the Academy. The article was picked up by the wire services and reprinted in many other newspapers, and it led to a flood of other articles, including important ones in the New York Times, People, Psychology Today, just to name a few, as well as invitations for me to appear at various television and radio programs. Interest was high because the BSU was unique in law enforcement at the time. Both Los Angeles and New York City had psychologists working for their police departments, but these men did not regularly profile criminals as we were doing. Another part of the outreach that I pioneered, much more deliberately than the publicity effort, was to the psychiatric and mental health communities. My outreach to psychiatry was part of an overall thrust of mine to go beyond the bounds of what had traditionally been the purview of the FBI and to link up with medical health professionals. I started doing so in mid-1970s and have kept it up since then. I certainly felt I could learn something from psychiatrists, psychologists, and other professionals involved in mental health, forensic sciences, prison work, and the like. And many of the mental health associations in particular were delighted to have a participant from the FBI at their gatherings. Invariably, when I appeared on a program as a representative of the FBI, there was a full house. I found that the indifference between presenting information about our work to law enforcement audience and to a room full of psychiatrists was that the police personnel generally sat, watched, and listened, often with folded arms, almost challenging me to tell them something they didn't already know. While the psychiatrists, perhaps because of their many years of attending classes, invariably took copious notes. An early key incident in my outreach to psychiatry happened when at a psychiatric conference I presented the case of Montel Rissel. This case had fascinated me since I first learned about it, principally because I had profiled the unknown rapist and murderer at the time of the crimes. I would have guessed wrong. The number and magnitude of his crimes suggested to me a man in his late 20s or early 30s. If I'd said or written that to the Alexandria, Virginia police when Rissel was still at large, they would have pursued the wrong sort of suspect. Given what I had come to know of the minds of murderers, I would have believed it improbable that someone still in his teens had been capable of committing a dozen rapes, of which in the last 5 of the victims were also murdered. But that's what Rissel had done. As a researcher, I had learned to look long and hard at information that challenges preconceptions, including the data about Montel Rissel. Rissel's problems had begun at the same young age as those of many of the offenders sketched earlier in this book, and he had a similar dysfunctional family, but everything else about him seemed to have been accelerated. He began raping women when he was 14. Convicted, he was sent to a psychiatric facility in Florida and committed 5 more rapes during the time he was technically in the charge of that facility. One while on vacation, another during a runaway episode, and others while he was actually living in the institution. in the facility's parking lot, at the public swimming pool, and the like. 3 weeks after coming home from a psychiatric facility, Rissel was charged with an attempted armed robbery that was actually an intended rape. This charge would take a year to work through the courts. And during that time, the judge assigned to him report regularly to a psychiatrist. Unfortunately, the psychiatrist's practice did not normally include violent juvenile offenders. Rissel saw the psychiatrist on a regular basis and, according to the psychiatrist's reports, made good progress. The progress was an illusion. During this year in which he was receiving treatment, Rissel, for the first time, murdered one of his rape victims. The crime took place in the vicinity of the apartment complex where he lived. When the year-old attempted robbery case came to trial, Rissel was convicted and sentenced to probation and continued psychiatric counseling. No one at the time of the robbery conviction had traced the murder to him or even suspected his involvement. During his probationary period, while still seeing the psychiatrist, Rissel committed 4 more rape murders near the apartment complex. There seemed no true pattern to the crimes. The rape victims differed. Some were young, others were in their 30s. Some were white, others black. Some were single, some married. The police continued to look for an outsider, and Rissel's arrest for these crimes came not as a result of a logical trail leading to his door, but rather from a chance search of his car. He confessed to the murders, was convicted, and given 5 life sentences. It was only after spending 2 years in prison that he told the authorities about the earlier rapes that he had committed while living in the psychiatric facility. Hey, Odin, you snoring, bud, huh? You in deep sleep? Did you see the moon? Okay. Checking on you. I interviewed Rissel in prison and found him to be quite articulate and forthcoming about his crimes, able to give considerable detail about his motivations and state of mind. And to trace these to roots in his childhood. He agreed to become part of our criminal personality research project and provided very good data for us. For instance, he recounted that he had let one rape victim go. He had not killed her because she told him that she had to support a member of her family who had cancer. A member of Rissel's family also had cancer, so he let his victim live. In our terms, he had become personally involved with the victim to such a large degree that he could no longer depersonalize her and kill her. This sort of information on Rissel is what I was recounting to a forensic psychiatric group in Chicago in the early 80s. With Rissel's mugshots on the screen, I was lecturing to an audience of 80 or so mental health professionals about the case. I was facing the door, and through it, I saw a scene that seemed as if it were out of an animated cartoon. A man walked by the door, peered in, and kept going. Then his head came back into frame, as it were, to look again, and the rest of the body followed. The man came into the lecture hall and took a seat down front near the lectern. He proceeded to watch and listen with rapt attention as I went on with my presentation. During it, I mentioned that Rissel had been seeing a psychiatrist during the time and that he was raping and murdering. And that psychiatrist had not realized that Rissel was lying through his teeth in order to get a doctor to award him a diagnosis of good progress. This, I suggested, was testimony to the manipulative genius of organized murderers. In my view, the problem stemmed from the historic reliance of traditional psychiatry on self-report. That is, that the patient will truthfully tell the doctor everything that has happened and will willingly participate in the healing process. Forensic psychiatry has learned not to rely solely on self-reports, but to use outside reports, court records, and the like, and to continually question the accuracy of what a patient offender discloses about his life and actions. During my presentation, the man who had come in and sat down was sweating profusely, beginning to look ashen. At the end of my lecture, the lights went on and people started to file out of the room. The sweating, white-faced, obviously troubled man came up and said he'd like to talk to me. "I'm a psychiatrist," he said. "You look like you need a psychiatrist," I retorted. "I'm Dr. Richard Ratner," he said. "I'm the guy who was gulled by Montel Rissel. I've agonized over this case for many years. Can we talk?" To condense a long story, we did talk and we became friends. I reiterated my concentration that he had been fooled by Rissel in much the same way as Rissel's rape and murder victims had, and that he should not blame himself too greatly for that. I went on to urge that in his future forensic work, it was imperative that he not rely completely on the self-reports of his patients' offenders. In recent years, Dr. Ratner has become an active convert to this idea, still disturbed by the notion that if he had been more astute in the Rissel case, the lives of several people might have been spared. Dr. Ratner lectures to groups and uses himself as an example of a man who was duped by a master manipulator. He has invited me to make grand rounds in psychiatry presentations at various hospitals in the Washington, D.C. area. I've brought him in at Quantico as a guest lecturer, and he has become an advisor on the Criminal Personality Research Project. Of such bonds, one hopes progress is made in the understanding of the criminal mind. I had been presenting to psychiatrists for some years when a second important incident occurred. It was at a similar gathering, and I was speaking about what I had come to label regressive necrophilia. I had on the screen a crime scene slide of a woman from whose vagina one could see a tree branch protruding. I explained that the term regressive necrophilia had been used to describe the insertion of foreign objects into the vagina or anus, something we had observed in cases involving seriously disorganized offenders. We interpreted it as an act that displayed tremendous hostility toward women and, at the same time, the offender's ignorance of consensual sexuality. It is an act that is often misinterpreted by crime scene analysis as a mutilation when it is actually a sexual substitution. One man in the audience, a non-forensic psychiatrist with silver hair, objected to the slide and to my presentation of the whole subject. He accused me of trying to shock the audience and insisted that this had to be a most unusual case, that there had never been another one like it. He interrupted the lecture to the point that I had to address him directly before I can continue. I asked the man how many crime scenes he'd ever evaluated. "None," he said. "I'm a psychiatrist, not a police officer." I stood my ground, saying that we had seen similar behavior in dozens of cases. He continued to say that this was absurd. Another member of the audience asked the protester to sit down and listen, and said that if he did, perhaps everyone might learn something. The protester could not be appeased, however, and stomped out. Later, other members of the audience suggested to me that he had been on overload and that he was too set in his ways to assimilate new information. They had found the presentation instructive, they said, and in general, I've had the same positive reaction from the dozens of professional groups to whom I've spoken in the last 15 or so years. By the fall of 1991, my attempts to bridge the psychiatric community were acknowledged when the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law honored me at their annual conference in Orlando, Florida, with its annual Amicus Award, given to the person who is an outsider to the field of psychiatry, has done the most to advance its knowledge. No other FBI agent has ever been considered for this award. From the beginning of my years at Quantico, I was determined that our work would be a two-way street, not one way, as had been the norm in the old FBI. Toward the end, I was constantly on the lookout to bring people who could help us to the FBI. Dr. Murray Mirren, an expert in psycholinguistics, had been brought in as a bureau consultant by Pat Mullany. My mentors, Mullany and Tetton, had also been instrumental in developing people within the Bureau who could assist hypnosis experts, whom we sometimes employ to help witnesses recall in more vivid detail what they'd seen in relation to a crime. I reached out to various forensic psychiatrists such as Drs. Park Dietz, James Kavanaugh, Richard Ratner, Robert Simon, and others, and for my criminal personality research project to Dr. Ann Burgess, and to such advisors as Dr. Marvin Wolfgang of the University of Pennsylvania, who had done pioneering studies of violent offenders. A good deal of my time was spent in lecturing to in-service agents and to the police who came to Quantico for courses. And for those courses, I always sought outside guest lecturers. Burris, Diaz, and others just mentioned came and spoke, as did Captain Frank Bowles, who had practically invented hostage negotiation for the New York City Police Department. I had noticed that no matter how lively our own presentations were, it was these guest lecturers who became the main topic of students' reports back to their superiors. I went far beyond law enforcement and forensic sciences to find interesting guests. A friend had told me that the patient in the Three Faces of Eve case, Chris Sizemore, had recovered from the multiple personality disorder that had been the basis I don't know, just like cut out. But look, now we have crickets. Can you guys hear me okay? We're almost done. Let me know. Hi, Bammy. Hi, Ashley. You guys still here? Let me know if you can hear me. I'm gonna actually test. Hold on. Hopefully, yeah, I think everyone. All right. Let's just continue really quick. Okay. Chris was a big hit, explaining what it was like to have a mental disorder and to recover from it. There had been several headline courtroom cases in which the defendant had tried to invoke a defense that involved multiple personalities. Chris spoke convincingly to the effect that if one of the patient's multiple personalities is capable of murder, all are. And that if one is not, neither are the others. Oh, Ashley, thank you. So you can hear me? Okay, good. And then tomorrow we're going to be doing the Johnny Depp. You guys will be up probably 3 hours before I will. I'm not getting up at 6 a.m. my time. Okay. In summary, she said that having multiple personalities did not exculpate a murder suspect. All of the guests contributed in some special way to our growing expertise. Other unusual visiting lecturers included a sculptor, Frank Bender, who specializes in constructing models that show what a suspect might look like after not having been seen in 10 or 20 years, and a psychic, Noreen Renner. This woman had been well recommended to me and had previously worked on some cases with local law enforcement entities, helping to locate dead bodies and providing similar clues. My superior told me that I was to tell our students that we were just presenting Rainer as an interesting lecturer, not recommending her to local police departments in any way, suggesting that we believed in what she was doing. She came to Quantico in early 1981, and in her lecture she told us that she was not in control of her powers, that they were sometimes on target and sometimes not. In front of a group of policemen that day, Rainer predicted that an attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan would take place before the end of the month. She said that the president would be hit in the left chest, that he would not die but would recover, gain a great deal of sympathy from the public, and go on to greater things. After Reagan was shot, I asked the psychic down for a second appearance at Quantico, and this time she predicted that the president would die in an assassination attempt in November at the hands of men in foreign uniforms wielding machine guns. This time I told the Secret Service about her predictions. They were upset that I hadn't brought them her first prediction, which I had initially thought was just a wild guess. She was both right and wrong about the November assassination. It was President Sadat of Egypt who died in October, not November, at the hands of men in foreign uniforms with machine guns. In another instance, she helped to locate a plane containing the body of a relative of the FBI agent. The psychic also predicted something in my own life. Several days before I was scheduled to leave on a 6-week trip to Germany, she told me that I would be coming back shortly because of something having to do with a dark-haired woman. 3 days after I landed in Germany, I was called back to the States because my wife, who had dark hair, had been in a terrible automobile accident. By this time, however, information that Rainier had lectured at Quantico had gotten out to the media, where it was distorted into a story that announced flatly that the psychic was an FBI consultant. A second story twisted the facts still further, saying that this psychic had been hired by the FBI to predict such things as assassination attempts. At Quantico, authorities were incensed at this and forbade me to invite Rainier to lecture again. A year or two later, we were confronted with a murder case that had happened right on the Quantico base to the wife of a DEA agent, a case that had had us stumped for a long time. While we were still perplexed by it, my superior, a novice to the BSU unit, came to me and asked whether I could invite the psychic down to lecture once more so that he could consult with her and see whether she could help on this murder case. I objected, reminding him that I had been told by a higher brass that we were not to use her anymore. He insisted that I bring her down anyway and agreed to take the heat if her presence became known. After her lecture, he whisked her out of the classroom and allowed her to see and touch the evidence associated with the case. But her input had no bearing on the case. which remains unsolved to this day. Even though the sort of publicity that Noreen Rainier had involved us in was not the best sort, the BSU continued to be the focus of outside interest. Early in the 1980s, that interest changed from documenting what we did to using it as a basis for fiction. Writers of articles, or even more so, of fiction, often expand in their work the idea of what the FBI can accomplish through profiling. They make profiling seem like a magic wand that, when available to police, instantly solves the crime. As readers of this book will know by now, magic has nothing to do with it. Profiling is merely the application of sound behavioral science principles and years of experience, gained in part by evaluating crime scenes and evidence, and also by interviewing incarcerated criminals, with the goal of pointing the police toward the most likely category of suspects. Profiling never catches a killer. Local police do that. No matter how many times we stress that point, fiction writers seem to want to have profilers in their own work do more. One day in the early 80s, the Public Affairs Office of the FBI asked me to take an author around the BSU. His name was Tom Harris, and he had already written one best-selling novel, Black Sunday, which had been made into a motion picture. Harris explained to me that he was writing another novel, and that was a serial killer, and a serial killer would be featured in it. He wanted to know how the FBI would get involved, how a profile would be done. Once again. Sorry. He and I spent several hours together, and during it, I showed him slides on various cases, among them those on Kemper and Chase. Harris was like a sponge, saying little but absorbing everything. We also discussed my already lengthy series of prison interviews, and I told him that lately we had been bringing various psychiatrists and other mental health experts into the Bureau for consultation. Later, Tom Harris fused the idea of prison interviews with reaching out to psychiatrists and used that in his novel Red Dragon, where the FBI agent churns for help to the now celebrated character of Hannibal Lecter, the psychiatrist and incarcerated serial killer who helps solve the mystery. The character and plot are entirely Harris's, of course, but I'm proud to have provided some facts on which his fertile imagination could work. After Red Dragon was published, I asked Harris why he had made his hero a civilian working with the Bureau and not an agent. He told me that he wanted the man to have mental problems as a result of his first run-in with Lecter, mental problems that would have disqualified him from being an agent. I thought this was comical, given that the weight losses, the pseudo-heart attacks, and other problems that many of us in the BSU had experienced. On a second visit, while he was working on another novel, I spent more hours with Harris and showed him other specific cases, including that of Ed Gein, who became part of the model for the villain in The Silence of the Lambs. I also introduced Harris to the lone female agent who was working with the BSU at the time. As fiction, both the Harris novels are superb, though they are not truly realistic in their portrayals either of serial killers or of the heroes or heroines inside the FBI. For instance, in The Serial Killer of the first book, Francis Dolarhyde, Harris combines attributes of several different sorts of killers, personality dynamics that would be highly unlikely to coexist in one person in the real world. Moreover, FBI agents don't personally go after such killers. We assess crime scenes, make personality profiles, and pass our suggestions on to local law enforcement agencies who do the hard field work and ultimately make the arrests. In the years since Harris came through the BSU, I've served as a source for other major authors writing novels and nonfiction books. Among the most prominent are Mary Higgins Clark, whose novel Loves Music, Loves to Dance was based in part on the presentation I made at the Harvey Glatman case. And Anne Rule. Anne Rule became a colleague of mine on the ViCAP task force, and she was later invited to lecture at Quantico on Ted Bundy. I consulted her on the case of Jerome Brudos, and she later went on to Oregon, did a lot of spade work, and wrote a book about him called Lust Killer. In recent years, the hue and cry about profiling and the misinterpretation of it, as well as what the Bureau legitimately does, has continued to increase. The media have come around to lionizing behavioral science people as super sleuths who put all other police to shame and solve cases where others have failed. Regrettably, the FBI itself seems to have jumped on this bandwagon. It was most evident in the Bureau's cooperation with the producers of the film The Silence of the Lambs. One of the last matters to pass across my desk before I retired was a script for that movie. I objected to several aspects of it. I felt that if the FBI was going to be involved in the filming to the extent of allowing Quantico to be used as a set, we ought to exert more influence to make the film realistic. For instance, the heroine, played by Jodie Foster in the movie, was an agent in training. We would never have placed a trainee in such a position of responsibility or danger as the script suggested. That detail could have easily been changed without damage to the factual structure, as could dozens of other details. They were not changed, however, and some of the scenes at Quantico even included Bureau personnel in extra or cameo roles. The powers that be inevitably reasoned the movie would be such good publicity for the Bureau that it made no difference whether or not the film was accurate. With the success and wide appeal of the book and movie The Silence of the Lambs, there came a frenzy to exploit both serial killers and their profilers. This was most apparent on television. Whereas earlier in the 1980s, there had been some legitimate programs about serial killers, the legitimate programming now fell away to the broadcast equivalents of tabloid journalism. My main complaint with most of the recent material is that it is hastily pulled together. For instance, one program that is often helpful to law enforcement is America's Most Wanted. However, even this program hastened to portray Joe Fisher in prison in New York as a man who had killed 150 people. That was Fisher's claim, but while he did kill his wife and perhaps a few other people, he had not murdered hundreds, and a little research would have shown that truth. Fisher, like Henry Lee Lucas, was a drifter and an alcoholic who liked the idea of making huge claims and finding himself featured in newspapers and on television. The avalanche of publicity has brought with it some strange and upsetting reactions. Several serial killers are now receiving letters in prison from people they do not know, people who write that they want to be just like them and emulate their deeds. I have also been told by individuals at various times that they think it would be interesting to go to a cocktail party and chat with a Ted Bundy or another serial killer. These murderers are awful examples of humanity and should not be idolized or emulated. Some people still in the BSU have also taken to claiming that they were the models for the FBI characters in the book and movie The Silence of the Lambs. Though Harris has stated, and I agree, that the characters are entirely his own and not based on any particular individuals. And the problem is not only with the old BSU hands. New applicants to the BSU are taking Jodie Foster's character as a role model. They too want to be super sleuths. If an aspirant to the police force identified too closely with Dirty Harry Callaghan, we'd have an awful lot of trigger-happy, violent, and dangerous cops. We don't need them. We don't need FBI super sleuths either. As a society, we seem to be flying too close to the flame, looking for stimulation. We are bored audiences more attuned to fantasy than to reality, in danger of falling completely into the abyss about which Nietzsche warned us. Since retiring from the FBI, I've worked as an expert witness and a lecturer. Among my recent cases was that of Ricky Green, a Texas murderer. He had killed a handful of people in seemingly random violence and was awaiting sentencing. I testified that he could be considered even more dangerous than Ted Bundy because while Bundy chose his victims by type, Green demonstrated a willingness to kill almost anyone. I can't tell what effect my testimony, separate from others, had on the outcome, but Green was sentenced to death. In more celebrated case in Rochester, New York, Arthur J. Shawcross was accused of 11 murders of area women, many of whom were prostitutes. Shawcross had previously served 14 years in the penitentiary, he had served 14 years in the penitentiary for the sexual assault and strangulation murder of an 8-year-old girl. He had also admitted to having killed a young boy, but that charge was dropped in exchange for a guilty plea to the girl's murder. Nonetheless, after 14 years, he had been released and had gone right back to killing. No doubt. In the new case, the serial murders of the prostitute, Shawcross had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Part of his defense was to be based on the notion that he'd been sexually, psychologically, and physically abused as a child. Another part of his contention that he suffered from mental condition of, quote, altered states, akin to multiple personality disorder. And a third strand to the defense that was Shawcross had a Vietnam-related mental illness, post-traumatic stress disorder. While my long-term friend and colleague, psychiatrist Dr. Park E. Dietz, advised the prosecution on how to deal with Shawcross's claims of child abuse and multiple personality disorder, I tackled the PTSD notion. By this time, I had put in 35 years of active duty and reserve time in Army, military, police, and CID matters, and my experience helped me to quickly debunk Shawcross's PTSD defense. My research showed me that his claim of having witnessed wartime atrocities was patently outrageous and untrue. And my pretrial work in this area was so strong that it shattered the PTSD issue in the case, to the point where the defense did not even seek to make it part of their insanity plea at the trial. The other two areas were similarly countered by Dr. Dietz, and Shawcross was convicted of 10 counts of murder in the second degree in one case, and 10 consecutive life sentences. And in a second case, he was convicted on 1 count of homicide and sentenced to 25 years to life. It is unlikely that he will leave prison alive. Along with the rest of the world in the summer of 1991, I read the headlines about Jeffrey Dahmer and his arrest in connection with 17 murders in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the details about sexual assaults, mutilation, cannibalism, and necrophilia. In his acts of violence, Dahmer seemed to have captured all the horror of serial and sexual killings during the last quarter century and rolled them together into one. In fact, he had been so sporadically active as a killer during a great deal of that period, as his first homicide had been committed in 1978 when he was 18, near his childhood home in Bath, Ohio. He had picked up a hitchhiker and killed him. Rather spontaneously, it appears, without a plan. 9 years went by, and his bizarre and murderous fantasies built up until he began killing again. Once in 1987, twice in 88, once in 89, 4 times in 1990, and 8 times in 1991. The last several killings separated only by days before he was caught. Looking at the case from the outside, it was clear to me that Dahmer followed the predictable pattern of serial killers. They begin killing cautiously, frightened of their crimes. Then the pace picks up and they progress to become effective and efficient killing machines. Eventually, they become cavalier and careless, convinced that they cannot be caught by any mortal. They believe they have the ultimate power and authority over others. As a reader knows, over the years, I've conducted hundreds of roadshows for the FBI about criminal personality assessment and psychological profiling, a number of them in the Milwaukee area. After my retirement, I was invited to give a similar course in Milwaukee in January of 91 under the sponsorship of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and did so in conjunction with Ken Lanning, who had become the Bureau's top expert in crimes entailing the exploitation and sexual assault of children. During my roadshows, I had developed many contacts among the police officers and attorneys and mental health professionals in the Milwaukee area. Thus, in a sense, it was no surprise that in August 1991, I received a letter from a Milwaukee police detective who had attended my course in January and who was now actively involved in the Dahmer investigation. I can't tell you enough how helpful the information you presented was in the recent events here in Milwaukee, the detective wrote. Knowing what to look for has been of great assistance to both me and to the other investigators involved in the Dahmer case as well. Although I was pleased to receive this endorsement, it saddened me to learn of the actions of certain other officers in the Dahmer case, those who were fired for having allowed a 14-year-old Laotian boy to remain in Dahmer's apartment even after they interviewed Dahmer and observed the highly suspicious circumstances in his apartment. I wish that those officers had had the opportunity to attend the course I'd given. Just as the detective had, I felt confident that if they had, the outcome of their initial interview with Dahmer would have been different. Dahmer killed the Laotian boy only minutes after the police had left him in Dahmer's custody. Moreover, Dahmer killed 4 more males in the next 2 months before he was apprehended. It is highly likely that 5 lives could have been saved had those street officers been more alert to the patterns and motives of sexual killers. Had the Milwaukee police in general been more aware of these matters, they might have made Dahmer a suspect even earlier, when a number of young men were disappearing from gay bars in the city. Realistically, though, the Milwaukee police cannot be blamed for such errors in judgment. Very few law enforcement officers in the country have been trained to recognize the complex dynamics of sexual offenders. The entire incident renews my belief that more training is needed for the police in this area. In the fall of 91, I was contacted by both the prosecution and the defense in the Dahmer case about testifying as an expert witness. My friend Park Dietz was going to work for the prosecution, and in a strange twist, I eventually determined to appear on the opposite side for the defense. For a former FBI agent to appear on the defense side in any case is highly unusual and might be misunderstood by most lay people, as well as by some of the people of my former FBI law enforcement colleagues. However, since leaving the Bureau and becoming a paid consultant and expert witness, I have come to understand that a true expert has but one opinion. And it really doesn't matter which side wants to call upon that opinion. And it really doesn't matter which side wants to use that opinion, because it's based on facts and expertise and cannot be altered to fit either the defense or the prosecution strategies. That's the basis on which I agreed to work with Gerald P. Boyle, the Milwaukee attorney charged with handling the defense of Jeffrey Dahmer. I could never appear in support of Dahmer's actions or behavior, but I do not condone the outrageous acts of killing. I could never appear in support of his, I do not condone the outrageous acts of killing 17 people, but I understand those acts and Dahmer's state of mind. My position is neither for nor against Dahmer, but it is most definitely for using my expertise to bring all parties to the correct level of understanding where they can fairly adjudicate the matter at hand. What I'm for is a criminal justice system that can most appropriately handle such difficult things as the Dahmer case. On January 13th, 1992, Attorney Boyle announced that Jeffrey Dahmer was prepared to change his plea to each of the 15 counts of murder for which he had been charged, from not guilty by reason of insanity to guilty but insane. The decision to plead guilty is Mr. Dahmer's, not mine, Boyle said to the press. This case is about his mental condition. It is his intent to plead guilty. The guilty but insane plea is possible under Wisconsin law, though it is not permitted in many other states. I agreed wholeheartedly with the decision to enter this plea. With Dahmer's guilt not in question, he will face an abbreviated trial, a second phase of which will focus only on his mental condition. Regardless of the outcome of that phase, it is a virtual certainty that Dahmer will spend the rest of his life in a secure facility, either a mental institution or a state penitentiary, and that, to my mind, is the correct conclusion to the case. By arranging to have Dahmer plead guilty, Gerald Boyle has saved the Milwaukee courts many weeks and possibly months of tedious trial testimony, as well as millions of dollars, and has permitted an outcome to the case that will serve the public very well. In conjunction with Dahmer's defense, I interviewed him for 2 days. In preparation for this, I delved into the case more deeply. The figure that came to my mind most immediately was the terrible specter of Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire killer whose crimes I detailed in Chapter 1. Dahmer, too, consumed blood and human flesh, but he was not as disorganized as Chase had been. This was a man who cruised the gay bars of Milwaukee in his search for victims and brought them back to his apartment, even though he knew that this course of action would make him vulnerable to police investigation. In this regard, he reminded me of John Gacy. Dahmer kept body parts such as skeletons and skulls, knowing that these could also be used as evidence against him if they were found. I also learned information that was part of the court record but had not yet been widely known, that Dahmer drank blood, consumed body parts, and preferred sexual contact with the dead and dismembered bodies of his victims. In these last actions, he reminded me of Ted Bundy and of Ed Kemper. I was astonished to learn that when Dahmer's last victim escaped his apartment in the midst of being attacked, Dahmer calmly waited for the police to arrive and made no effort to destroy or conceal the great amount of evidence that he had in his rooms. And that evidence was massive, consisting of hundreds of photographs and of victims, both dead and alive, skulls and body parts in the refrigerator and in drums and boxes. Paraphernalia used to restrain and kill the victims was scattered throughout the apartment. I was heartsick to learn that in the months prior to his arrest, Dahmer let outsiders, including his landlord and the police, into his apartment when the paraphernalia was present and in full view in the living room and in adjacent rooms whose doors were open. All the signs of this killer were there, but no one had heeded them. While Dahmer exhibited many of the characteristics of the organized offender, he hunted victims, lured them to his apartment with promises of money and favors, and after death hid and concealed the evidence of his crimes. He also exhibited many dynamics associated with the disorganized offender. He had sex with his victims after death, consumed their flesh, mutilated their bodies, and kept body part souvenirs. In our terminology, then, Dahmer was a mixed offender. In fact, he encompasses so many usually unrelated dynamics that we may have to make him a prime example of an entirely new category of serial killer. Is Dahmer sane or insane? After 2 days interviewing him, I felt only empathy for the tormented and twisted person who sat before me. Dahmer was as candid and as cooperative as any serial murderer whom I've ever confronted. And yet, he could not comprehend how he could have committed all of the atrocious deeds that we knew he had done. In the controlled prison environment, he was able to realize the extent to which his compulsions and fantasies had taken over his rational mind, driving him on murder after murder. He chain smoked during the entire interview and suggested that lung cancer might be the solution to his problems. There was no way to view this tormented man as having been sane at the time of his crime. I was glad that no matter what way the court proceedings would go, he would spend the rest of his life in custody. I was equally glad that there was no death penalty in the state of Wisconsin because it would serve no purpose for the state to kill him. The state of Florida spent $7 or $8 million to execute Ted Bundy, money that might have been better used to build a forensic penal facility devoted to the research and study of people like Bundy, Kemper, Gacy, Berkowitz, and Dahmer, who have so horrendously violated society's trust. Criminologists have long agreed that the death sentence has never deterred violent offenders. It serves only to satisfy the families of victims and society's general desire for revenge. If, as in the Dahmer case, we can assure the public that these monsters will not be allowed to complete a few years of incarceration and then slip back into our society, if we can agree to keep them in custody for the rest of their lives, then we have made progress. Precisely where and how they are kept away from society should not be an issue. The existence of a Jeffrey Dahmer spurs me to press on with my research. There are some murderers in prison cells around the country whom I haven't yet talked to. I'm still professionally involved with the Department of Justice's National Institute of Justice and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the investigation and analysis of those who molest, abduct, and murder children. I maintain faculty affiliations with Michigan State University's School of Criminal Justice and with Georgetown University's program on psychiatry and the law, and also lecture occasionally at several other universities. Though I will shortly retire from the U.S. Army Reserve and from the CID, I plan to go on training CID agents around the world, so long as the Army wants me to do so. It would be so gratifying to believe that all of the work that I've done in regard to violent offenders has made a dent in the incidence of violent crime, but the headlines about terrible murders that crop up regularly in the nation's newspapers and the routine reports of violence on the nightly news broadcast tell me that the fight against monsters goes on, and that I must continue to be in the thick of it. We're done. Thank you guys. So that was 3 hours, longer than we normally go, but we finished it. I think I'm going to do like some nursery books. I think I'm going to do some Dr. Seuss next. And then we'll do this guy. What do you guys think? You think we should do the Gonzo Papers, or should we do Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, or the Rum Diaries? He is a trip as a writer. I swear, like, I was going to do the Baja 500 because of him, because he came out with that. Like, this is like 15 years ago. I wanted to do the Baja 500 because I'm really into like driving. Like, I'm really into torque and fast cars. And I was like, I'm building a Baja 500 car. And then I realized how much money and sponsorship money I would need. And I was like, okay, no. I don't think anyone's going to donate $200,000 for me to race around the desert. So, but that's Hunter S. Thompson right there. And it's a painting that a friend did. I just brought him in and for this occasion. So you guys, tomorrow morning, Tiff Savgirl is doing the Johnny Depp trial. I will join you guys with some coffee in the chat, as long as I don't have to work really early. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for being here. Bammy, Ashley Leith. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you, Bammy. Thank you, Ashley. It was a long read. Hopefully, my voice kept up. You guys relax. Get you guys into some bed sheets and cover up and yes, be half asleep. Don't wake up. Shh, don't wake up. Go to bed, and I'll be joining you guys in sleep pretty soon. I'm pretty tired. And we'll talk in the morning. Love you guys so much. Good night.